Hello everyone. Tonight, I've prepared a special compilation of trucker tales, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now, let's begin. The Harmony Diner, from Jake Morrison. The rain had been my companion for the better part of 300 miles, drumming against the windshield of my Kenworth with a rhythm that almost put me to sleep, despite the caffeine coursing through my veins. Interstate 89 stretched ahead through the Vermont mountains, a ribbon of wet asphalt disappearing into the autumn fog that clung to the valleys like something alive. My CB radio crackled occasionally with distant conversations between drivers I'd never meet, their voices fading in and out like ghosts on the airwaves. It was past 2 in the morning when I saw the soft glow of neon cutting through the mist ahead, spelling out Harmony Diner in letters that flickered with the tired persistence of a place that had been open too long. I hadn't planned on stopping, but my fuel gauge was dancing closer to empty than I liked, and the coffee I'd picked up at the last truck stop tasted like it had been brewing since the Clinton administration. The diner sat at the edge of a small parking area, surrounded by towering pines that swayed in the wind with a sound like whispered secrets. A few cars dotted the lot, their windows fogged with condensation, and I could see the warm yellow light spilling from the diner's windows onto the wet pavement. As I downshifted and felt the engine brake catch, slowing my rig to a crawl, I noticed something that made me pause with my hand on the door handle. Music was drifting from the building, clear and beautiful despite the rain and the rumble of my idling diesel. It wasn't the tinny sound of a jukebox or the compressed audio of a radio, but something richer, fuller, like a live performance. The melody was hauntingly familiar yet impossible to place, weaving through the night air with a quality that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my chest. I sat there for a moment, listening, trying to identify the song, but it kept shifting just beyond recognition, like trying to remember a dream after waking. The harmony was perfect, multiple voices blending in ways that made my skin prickle with an emotion I couldn't name. When I finally climbed down from the cab, the music became even clearer, and I realized it was coming from inside the diner. Through the rain-streaked windows, I could see the silhouettes of other patrons seated at the counter and in booths, their heads turned slightly as if they were listening to something wonderful. The parking lot felt strangely quiet despite the storm, as if the music created a bubble of calm around the building. My boots splashed through puddles that reflected the neon sign, and I noticed that the reflection seemed to pulse in time with the melody, though that could have been a trick of the rippling water. The bell above the door chimed as I entered, but the sound was somehow absorbed by the music that filled the space like a physical presence. The interior was classic Americana, all red vinyl booths and black and white checkered floors, with a long counter that curved along one wall beneath a row of pendant lights that cast warm pools of illumination. The air was thick with the smell of coffee and bacon grease, comfort food and late-night sustenance, but underneath it all was something else, something that reminded me of old churches and concert halls, spaces where music had soaked into the very walls over decades of performance. What struck me immediately was that I couldn't see any band, no stage, no musicians anywhere in the diner. The music seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, from the air between the tables, from the spaces where light met shadow. It was beautiful beyond description, voices harmonizing in ways that made my eyes water with something that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite joy. The other patrons sat with expressions of rapt attention, their coffee cups cooling forgotten in their hands, their meals growing cold as they listened to the impossible concert that surrounded us all. A waitress approached me with a smile that seemed to shine from within, her name tag reading melody and cheerful script. Her uniform was pristine despite the late hour, and she moved with a grace that seemed to match the rhythm of the music that continued to flow around us. When she spoke, her voice blended seamlessly with the ongoing harmony, as if she were part of the performance even while taking my order. She led me to a booth near the window where I could watch my truck and listen to what she called tonight's special program. Though when I asked about the singers, her smile only deepened and she suggested I try the apple pie. As I sat there, nursing coffee that was far better than any diner coffee had a right to be, I began to notice things that didn't quite fit together properly. The music never stopped, never paused between songs, but flowed continuously like a river of sound that carried me along its current. The other customers had been there when I arrived, and they remained motionless, transfixed, their eyes reflecting the warm light of the pendant lamps with an intensity that suggested they were seeing something I couldn't perceive. When I looked directly at any of them, they appeared normal, but in my peripheral vision they seemed to shimmer slightly, as if they existed in the space between one note and the next. The pie, when it arrived, was extraordinary, tasting like autumn evenings and childhood memories, like every perfect slice of apple pie that had ever existed distilled into one transcendent dessert. But as I ate, I realized that the music was changing, becoming more complex, adding instruments that shouldn't have been possible in the small space of the diner. I could hear strings now, a full orchestra section that seemed to emanate from the booth behind me, and brass that resonated from somewhere near the kitchen door. The harmonies were building toward something, growing in intensity and complexity, and the other patrons were leaning forward in their seats as if drawn by invisible strings. It was then that I noticed the waitress, Melody, had begun to sing along, her voice joining the invisible choir with a clarity that made the air itself seem to vibrate. Her song was wordless but full of meaning, a melody that spoke of things lost and found, of journeys that ended where they began, of travelers who discovered that some destinations existed outside the normal flow of time and space. The other patrons had joined her now, their voices rising in perfect harmony despite the fact that none of them appeared to be moving their lips, their faces serene as the music flowed through them and out into the night. I found myself humming along, the melody coming to me as naturally as breathing, as if I had always known this song and was only now remembering it. My coffee cup was empty, but I couldn't remember finishing it, and when I looked at my watch, the hands seemed to be moving in slow circles that didn't correspond to any earthly measurement of time. The rain against the windows had synchronized itself with the rhythm of the music, and through the glass I could see that the fog had lifted, revealing a landscape that looked nothing like the Vermont mountains I had been driving through. Rolling hills covered in flowers that glowed with their own inner light stretched to a horizon that curved upward like the inside of a vast bowl, and in the sky stars arranged themselves in patterns that spelled out sheet music across the darkness. The realization came slowly, creeping over me like the dawn that was conspicuously absent from the strange sky outside. This wasn't just a diner that happened to have good acoustics or hidden speakers. This was something else entirely, a place where music had become a living thing, where harmony had taken on a will of its own and drawn listeners into its embrace. The patrons around me weren't customers at all, but instruments in a vast orchestra, their individual voices contributing to a symphony that had been playing for who knows how long. The waitress approached my table again, and this time I could see that her smile was tinged with something that might have been sympathy or might have been hunger. The music was reaching a crescendo now, the invisible orchestra swelling to a volume that should have been overwhelming, but instead felt like being wrapped in velvet. I could feel my own voice wanting to join the harmony, my throat vibrating with the urge to add my part to the eternal song. The pie plate in front of me was cracked down the middle, a hairline fracture that seemed to mirror something breaking inside my chest. And I realized with a clarity that cut through the musical haze that if I didn't leave now, I would become another permanent member of this impossible choir, another voice in the harmony that sang with no visible source. Fighting against the pull of the music was like swimming upstream in a river of honey, every movement requiring tremendous effort, while the current tried to drag me back toward the warm embrace of eternal song. I fumbled for my wallet, but Melody waved away my money with that luminous smile, her voice still weaving through the harmonies as she told me that the music was payment enough, that my voice was all the currency they needed. The other patrons turned to look at me as I stood, and in their eyes I saw not malice but a kind of peaceful resignation, the contentment of those who had found their purpose and would never need to search for it again. The Polyglot's Cargo. From Marcus Chen. The Kenworth's diesel engine hummed its familiar lullaby as I guided her through the pre-dawn darkness of Interstate 70, somewhere between the sleeping towns of Salina and Hayes in the heart of Kansas. Rain drummed steadily against the windshield, each droplet catching the amber glow of my running lights before sliding away into the void. 23 years I'd been hauling freight across this country, and I'd learned to find comfort in nights like these, the rhythmic thrum of 18 wheels on wet asphalt, the soft hiss of air brakes at distant truck stops, the gentle sway of whatever cargo rode behind me through the endless American night. What made this particular run unusual wasn't the weather or the route, but the manifest clipped to my visor. Usually the paperwork told a simple story, 40,000 pounds of automotive parts from Detroit to Denver, or a load of grain from Nebraska to Texas. Standard stuff that made sense in black ink on white paper. But this manifest was different. The cargo description seemed to shift every time I glanced at it, written in what appeared to be multiple languages I couldn't identify. The shipping company, Babel Logistics, wasn't one I'd worked with before, but they'd paid triple the usual rate for this overnight haul from their warehouse in Kansas City to a distribution center in Grand Junction, Colorado. The paperwork had been handed to me by a thin man in an expensive suit who spoke with an accent I couldn't place, something that seemed to change mid-sentence from Eastern European to something that might have been Middle Eastern, then to tones that reminded me of languages I'd heard in Chinatown back in San Francisco. He'd insisted I not open the trailer or inspect the cargo, explaining that the containers were sealed for customs purposes, though he hadn't specified which customs or why a domestic haul would require such measures. As I drove through the rain-soaked Kansas night, I found myself glancing repeatedly at that manifest. In the dim light of my cab, the text seemed to writhe and shift, and I began to wonder if fatigue was playing tricks with my eyes. What had looked like Russian Cyrillic when I'd first examined it at the truck stop now appeared to be Arabic script, and below that, symbols that resembled Chinese characters, though I'd grown up around enough Chinese writing to know these weren't quite right. The numbers remained consistent: container weights, quantities, reference codes, but the descriptions of the actual cargo kept transforming into languages that felt both familiar and utterly foreign. The radio had been unusually quiet all night, none of the usual chatter from other drivers fighting the same weather and darkness. Even the AM station seemed muted, fading in and out with an odd cadence that almost sounded like whispered conversations in languages I couldn't understand. I tried switching to my usual late-night talk radio, but found only static punctuated by what sounded like fragments of voices speaking in rapid, overlapping tongues that made my head ache if I listened too closely. The Polyglot's Cargo, from Marcus Chen. The Kenworth's diesel engine hummed its familiar lullaby as I guided her through the pre-dawn darkness of Interstate 70, somewhere between the sleeping towns of Salina and Hayes in the heart of Kansas. Rain drummed steadily against the windshield, each droplet catching the amber glow of my running lights before sliding away into the void. 23 years I'd been hauling freight across this country, and I'd learned to find comfort in nights like these. The rhythmic thrum of 18 wheels on wet asphalt, the soft hiss of air brakes at distant truck stops, the gentle sway of whatever cargo rode behind me through the endless American night. What made this particular run unusual wasn't the weather or the route, but the manifest clipped to my visor. Usually the paperwork told a simple story: 40,000 pounds of automotive parts from Detroit to Denver, or a load of grain from Nebraska to Texas. Standard stuff that made sense in black ink on white paper. But this manifest was different. The cargo description seemed to shift every time I glanced at it, written in what appeared to be multiple languages I couldn't identify. The shipping company, Babel Logistics, wasn't one I'd worked with before, but they paid triple the usual rate for this overnight haul from their warehouse in Kansas City to a distribution center in Grand Junction, Colorado. The paperwork had been handed to me by a thin man in an expensive suit who spoke with an accent I couldn't place, something that seemed to change mid-sentence from Eastern European to something that might have been Middle Eastern, then to tones that reminded me of languages I'd heard in Chinatown back in San Francisco. He'd insisted I not open the trailer or inspect the cargo, explaining that the containers were sealed for customs purposes, though he hadn't specified which customs or why a domestic haul would require such measure. As I drove through the rain-soaked Kansas night, I found myself glancing repeatedly at that manifest. In the dim light of my cab, the text seemed to writhe and shift, and I began to wonder if fatigue was playing tricks with my eye. What had looked like Russian Cyrillic when I'd first examined it at the truck stop now appeared to be Arabic script, and below that symbols that resembled Chinese characters, though I'd grown up around enough Chinese writing to know these weren't quite right. The numbers remained consistent: container weights, quantities, reference codes, but the descriptions of the actual cargo kept transforming into languages that felt both familiar and utterly foreign. The radio had been unusually quiet all night. None of the usual chatter from other drivers fighting the same weather and darkness. Even the AM station seemed muted, fading in and out with an odd cadence that almost sounded like whispered conversations in languages I couldn't understand. I tried switching to my usual late-night talk radio, but found only static punctuated by what sounded like fragments of voices, speaking in rapid overlapping tongues that made my head ache if I listened too closely. Around 3 in the morning, as I approached the Colorado border, I pulled into a 24-hour truck stop for fuel and a cup of coffee. The place was nearly deserted, just a couple of other rigs parked in the shadows, and a lone clerk behind bulletproof glass, who nodded wordlessly as I paid for my diesel. When I tried to strike up conversation about the weather, he responded in what sounded like Portuguese, then seemed surprised when I looked confused, and switched to heavily accented English, apologizing and claiming he was still half asleep. Back in my cab with a steaming cup of coffee that tasted faintly of cardamom and spices I couldn't identify, I decided to take another look at the manifest. Under the harsh LED light I'd installed above my sleeper berth, the document appeared normal again. Standard English descriptions of machine parts and electronic components. But when I moved it back into the softer glow of my dashboard lights, the foreign characters returned, seeming to pulse and shift like living things. I rubbed my eyes, wondering if the long night was getting to me more than usual. As I rolled back onto the interstate, I became aware of a sound that hadn't been there before, a low humming that seemed to come from the trailer behind me. At first I assumed it was just the road noise, or maybe the way the wind was catching the trailer's edges, but as I listened more carefully, the sound took on an almost musical quality, like voices singing in harmony, though the melody was unlike anything I'd ever heard. The harmonies wove together and apart in patterns that seemed to follow mathematical rules rather than musical ones, creating intervals that made my spine tingle with unease. The GPS began acting strangely as I climbed into the Colorado foothills, the screen flickering between English directions and what appeared to be turn-by-turn instructions in various foreign languages. The mechanical voice that usually guided me through unfamiliar routes started speaking in a mixture of tongues, sometimes beginning a sentence in English and finishing it in what might have been Hindi or Thai or something else entirely. I tried resetting the system, but each reboot brought a different language configuration, as if the device was cycling through every linguistic database it had ever encountered. By 4:30 in the morning, as I navigated the winding mountain roads west of Denver, the humming from my trailer had evolved into something that definitely sounded like voices. Not singing now, but speaking in what seemed to be dozens of different languages simultaneously, creating a polyglot chorus that rose and fell with the rhythm of my engine. The sound was muffled by the trailer walls and the steady rainfall, but clear enough that I could distinguish individual words and phrases, though none in any language I could understand. I tried turning up my radio to drown out the voices, but every station I found seemed to be broadcasting in foreign languages, each one different from the last. A classical music station played what sounded like an opera sung in a language that used clicking sounds and tonal variations, unlike anything I'd ever heard. A country station featured songs with familiar melodies but lyrics in what might have been an indigenous language from some remote corner of the world. Even the weather reports came through in rapid French, then German, then something that sounded almost like Latin but with modern meteorological terminology. The manifest in my peripheral vision had become a living document, the text flowing and changing like water, cycling through scripts and symbols from every corner of human civilization, and some that didn't look quite human at all. Hieroglyphic-style pictographs transformed into flowing Arabic calligraphy, which melted into angular Germanic runes, which shifted into the precise strokes of Chinese characters, which dissolved into symbols that hurt to look at directly, as if they were designed for eyes with different focal lengths than human ones. The sounds began to synchronize with my turn signals, my gear changes, the rhythm of my windshield wipers, as if the cargo was somehow aware of my driving and responding to my movements. When I tapped my brakes going into a curve, the voices would pause, then resume with a different cadence. When I accelerated up a hill, they would rise in pitch and intensity. The strangest part was that despite not understanding a single word, I began to feel like I was starting to comprehend something underneath the babble of tongues, not the literal meaning of individual words or phrases, but some deeper message being conveyed through the patterns and rhythms of all those overlapping voices. It was as if meaning could be transmitted through the spaces between languages, through the universal human cadences of urgency, pleading, warning, desperation. By the time I reached Grand Junction, just as the sun was painting the desert horizon a pale gold, the voices had fallen silent, and the manifest had returned to plain English. The delivery address led me to a warehouse district, where a crew of workers who spoke perfect, unaccented English helped me unhook the trailer without comment. They moved with efficient professionalism, though I noticed they avoided making eye contact and seemed eager to get the cargo inside their building as quickly as possible. The thin man in the expensive suit appeared as I was completing my paperwork, paying me in cash as promised and thanking me for my discretion. When I asked about the nature of the cargo, he smiled and explained that his company specialized in linguistic preservation, recording and cataloging endangered languages from around the world before they disappeared forever. The containers, he claimed, held digital archives and recording equipment for a cultural preservation project funded by various international organizations. His explanation made sense, and I wanted to believe it. But as I drove my empty rig toward my next pickup, I couldn't shake the feeling that those voices I'd heard had been trying to tell me something important, something urgent, something that maybe I should have tried harder to understand. The radio returned to normal English broadcasts. The GPS resumed its familiar mechanical English directions, and the manifest for my next load was written in perfectly ordinary language that stayed put on the page where it belonged. The song "In the Mist," that from Marcus. The fog rolled in like a living thing, that October night, thick and deliberate, swallowing the highway mile by mile as I pushed my Peterbilt through the Pennsylvania mountains. I'd been driving these routes for 15 years, hauling everything from furniture to farm equipment, and I thought I knew every twist and turn of Interstate 80 like the lines on my weathered hands. The diesel engine hummed its familiar lullaby beneath me, the dashboard lights casting their amber glow across my face as the radio crackled with distant static. Weather Service had mentioned possible fog in the valleys, but nothing like this ethereal blanket that seemed to rise from the earth itself. It was so faint, so delicate, that I assumed it was just the wind whistling through the cab's weather stripping, or perhaps some distant AM station bleeding through the static. But as the fog grew thicker, wrapping around my truck like cotton batting, the sound became clearer, more distinct. It was music, soft and haunting, weaving through the mist with an otherworldly quality that made the hair on my arms stand on end. The melody was unlike anything I'd ever heard, neither classical nor contemporary, but something ancient and timeless that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and resonate directly in my chest. I slowed the big rig to 30 miles per hour, then 20, my hands gripping the steering wheel as the fog pressed against the windshield like curious fingers. The wipers swept back and forth in their steady rhythm, but they might as well have been trying to clear away smoke for all the good they did. The yellow lines on the asphalt disappeared completely, leaving me to navigate by instinct and the faint glow of the reflectors that appeared like ghostly breadcrumbs in my headlight beams. The music grew stronger, more complex, as if an entire orchestra was hidden somewhere in the mist, playing a symphony written by angels or something far older than human understanding. My CB radio had gone completely silent, not even the usual chatter from other drivers cutting through the night. I tried calling out on Channel 19, asking if anyone else was experiencing the strange weather, but my voice seemed to die in the static. swallowed by the same mysterious force that had brought this supernatural fog. The isolation was complete and profound, as if my truck had been lifted from the earthly highway and suspended in some liminal space between worlds. Even my GPS had given up, the screen flickering between various impossible locations, before finally displaying nothing but a blue void, dotted with question marks. I could hear strings that sounded like they were made of moonlight, percussion that echoed like heartbeats in a vast cathedral, and wind instruments that seemed to breathe with the fog itself. The melody pulled at something deep in my memory, stirring emotions I couldn't name and recollections of dreams I'd never had. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, like watching a storm approach across an open plain, knowing its power could destroy you while being unable to look away from its majesty. As the symphony swirled around my cab, I began to notice other sounds woven into the composition. There were voices, human voices, singing in languages I didn't recognize but somehow understood. On a primal level, they spoke of journeys that never ended, of travelers who had become lost in the spaces between destinations, of highways that existed only in the fog and led to places that cartographers had never mapped. The voices were neither male nor female, young nor old, but something beyond such simple categorizations, and they called to me with a longing that made my heart ache with homesickness for a home I'd never seen. My truck began to slow on its own, the engine responding to some authority higher than my foot on the accelerator. The fog grew so thick that I could barely see the hood ornament, and the music reached a crescendo that seemed to make the very air vibrate with supernatural energy. Through the windshield, I began to see lights, not the harsh glare of oncoming traffic or the steady shine of highway fixtures, but soft, dancing illuminations that pulsed in time with the otherworldly melody. They approached slowly, gracefully, like fireflies performing an ancient ritual, and I realized with growing wonder and terror that the lights were moving to the rhythm of the music. The dancing lights began to take shape, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly, but filled me with an inexplicable sense of recognition. They swirled and separated, came together and spun apart, as if choreographed by the same intelligence that conducted the impossible orchestra hidden in the mist. Some of the lights were warm and golden, others cold and silver, and a few pulsed with colors that I had no names for, hues that existed only in the space between sleeping and waking. As they danced, the music grew more insistent, more personal, as if it were being composed specifically for me in that moment. The music promised things that my rational mind knew were impossible: an end to loneliness, a purpose beyond simply moving cargo from point A to point B, understanding of mysteries that had plagued humanity since we first looked up at the stars and wondered what lay beyond. My hand touched the cold metal of the handle, and for a moment I could feel the fog pressing against the door like living water, eager to embrace me and carry me away from the mundane world of schedules and delivery deadlines. But somewhere in the deeper recesses of my mind, a small voice of self-preservation began to whisper warnings. This was not natural, not safe, not meant for the living. The music, beautiful as it was, carried undertones of loss and separation that spoke of drivers who had pulled over in similar fog and never returned to their The dancing lights, mesmerizing as they appeared, cast no shadows and reflected in no surface, suggesting they were glimpses of something that existed outside the normal flow of time and space. I forced my hand away from the door handle, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white, and pressed my foot firmly on the accelerator. The truck lurched forward reluctantly, as if it too had been seduced by the supernatural symphony, and was loath to leave its influence. The music rose to an almost overwhelming volume, no longer beautiful but demanding, insistent, angry at my rejection of its otherworldly invitation. The dancing lights pressed closer to my windshield, their cold illumination revealing shapes in the fog that looked almost human, figures with arms outstretched in welcome or warning. Their faces, if they had faces, were obscured by the mist, but I could feel their disappointment like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I drove through the supernatural tempest for what felt like hours but could have been minutes, time having become as unreliable as distance in that otherworldly fog. The music followed me, sometimes fading to a whisper, sometimes swelling to a roar that made the truck's windows vibrate in their frames. The lights danced alongside my cab, keeping pace effortlessly, occasionally reaching out with tendrils of illumination that seemed to test the barriers between their realm and mine. My radio continued to produce nothing but static, and my cell phone displayed no signal bars, as if all earthly communication had been severed by the supernatural storm. The music grew fainter, more distant, like a radio station fading as you drive beyond its range. The dancing lights performed one final, elaborate spiral around my truck before retreating into the mist, their glow diminishing until they were nothing more than faint sparks in my rearview mirrors. The familiar yellow lines of the interstate began to reappear beneath my tires, and the reflectors resumed their steady march into the darkness ahead. My speedometer showed that I was traveling at normal highway speed, though I had no memory of accelerating back to that pace. The fog lifted completely as I crested a hill, revealing the normal nighttime landscape of Pennsylvania forests and distant farmhouse lights. My radio crackled back to life with the mundane chatter of other drivers discussing weather conditions and truck stop location. My GPS reoriented itself, cheerfully announcing that I was exactly where I should be according to my planned route, with no time lost despite the supernatural detour. Everything returned to normal so completely that I might have dismissed the entire experience as fatigue-induced hallucination, if not for one lingering detail. The music continued, faint but unmistakable, seeming to emanate from the fog that still clung to my mirrors and the spaces between the cab and trailer. It was quieter now, almost inaudible beneath the diesel engine and road noise, but it was there nonetheless, a ghostly remnant of the otherworldly symphony that had tried to claim me. Even now, months later, I sometimes hear it in the quiet moments between gears, a haunting melody that speaks of highways that exist only in the mist, and journeys that never truly end. I've driven that same stretch of Interstate 80 dozens of times since that October night, but the fog has never returned. The double take. From Marcus Webb. The ZB radio crackled with static as I pulled my Peterbilt into the rest stop outside Nowhere, Nevada, the kind of place that exists solely because truckers need somewhere to sleep between the endless stretches of desert highway. It was past midnight, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like dying insects, casting everything in that sickly yellow glow that makes even the healthiest person look like a corpse. I'd been driving for 14 hours straight, my eyes burning from staring at the hypnotic white lines, and my body ached in places I didn't know could ache. The parking lot was mostly empty, just a few other big rigs scattered across the cracked asphalt like sleeping giants. I found a spot near the back, away from the main lights, where the darkness felt more welcoming than the artificial brightness. As I shut down the engine, the sudden silence was almost deafening, after hours of the diesel's constant rumble. That's when I noticed the other truck parked about 50 yards away, barely visible in the shadows between two burned-out lampposts. Same model Peterbilt, same faded blue paint job, same rust stains along the trailer, where the desert had been eating away at the metal for years. Same company logo on the door that I could barely make out in the dim light. For a moment I thought I was seeing double, the way your vision can play tricks on you after too many hours on the road. But no, it was definitely there. A perfect mirror of my own rig, right down to the small dent in the front bumper from that parking incident in Tucson 6 months ago. I climbed down from the cab, my boots crunching on the gravel, and walked slowly toward the other truck. The desert air was cool against my skin, carrying the faint smell of sage and something else I couldn't quite identify, something metallic and strange. As I got closer, I could see the details more clearly in the pale moonlight. The license plate was the same. The company number painted on the trailer was identical. Even the small crack in the passenger side window that I'd been meaning to fix for months was there, running in the exact same diagonal pattern. My heart started beating faster, that uncomfortable rhythm you get when something is fundamentally wrong with the world but you can't quite put your finger on what it is. I walked around the truck, checking every detail, every scratch and scuff mark, and they were all there. Perfect replicas of the wear and tear that accumulated on my own rig over 3 years of cross-country hauling. The trailer doors even had the same combination lock hanging from the latch, the numbers worn away in the same pattern from my finger. The curtains were drawn across the sleeper berth, but there was a faint glow coming from inside, probably from a reading light, or maybe a phone screen. I tapped gently on the window, that polite knock that truckers use to wake each other without causing a heart attack. The figure stirred and slowly turned toward me. Not similar, not a resemblance. It was exactly my face, down to the small scar above my left eyebrow, from a childhood accident, and the slightly crooked nose that had never healed, quite right after a bar fight in my 20s. He smiled, and it was my smile, the same lopsided grin that had charmed waitresses and gotten me out of speeding tickets from coast to coast. He rolled down the window, and when he spoke, it was with my voice. The same slight rasp from too many cigarettes and too much shouting over engine noise. "Hell of a coincidence, isn't it?" he said, gesturing at our identical trucks. "Though I suppose it's not that strange. They made thousands of these rigs, and we're both working for the same company." I found myself nodding, even though every instinct I had was screaming that this was impossible. People don't just randomly encounter their exact doubles driving identical trucks in the middle of the Nevada desert. But there's something about the deep hours of the night that makes you accept things you'd never believe in daylight. When the rational world feels thin and fragile. "Phoenix, then up to Salt Lake," he replied. And those were exactly the same destinations on my manifest. The same road I'd been driving every month for the past year. "You?" He leaned back in his seat, studying me with eyes that I recognized, because they were my own eyes. The same pale blue with the small flecks of green that my mother had always said reminded her of seawater. "You look tired," he said. "When's the last time you got some real sleep?" It was a good question. I'd been pushing hard to make this delivery on time, grabbing naps in truck stops and gas stations, surviving on coffee and energy drinks, and the kind of stubborn determination that keeps the freight moving across America. Real sleep, the kind where you actually dream and wake up feeling human again, had been weeks ago. Too long, I admitted. "I'll keep watch. Make sure nobody bothers you." Professional courtesy. There was something unsettling about the offer, but I was too exhausted to analyze what it might be. The sleeper berth in my cab suddenly seemed incredibly inviting, the narrow mattress promising relief from the bone-deep fatigue that had been building for days. I thanked him and walked back to my truck, feeling his eyes following me across the parking lot. Inside my cab, I pulled the curtains closed and stretched out on the thin mattress, still fully clothed. Through the fabric, I could see the faint outline of the other truck, a darker shadow against the night sky. The desert was quiet except for the occasional distant rumble of traffic on the interstate, and despite the strangeness of the encounter, I found myself drifting toward sleep. I dreamed of driving, which wasn't unusual for a trucker. In the dream, I was behind the wheel of my Peterbilt, but the highway stretched endlessly in both directions, and no matter how fast I drove, the scenery never changed. The same desert, the same distant mountains, the same stars overhead, frozen in place like a photograph. In my mirrors, I could see another truck following me, always maintaining the same distance no matter how I varied my speed. I knew without looking that it was the other me, the one from the rest stop, and I had the growing certainty that he was gaining on me, even though the distance never seemed to change. Pale sunlight was filtering through the curtains, and according to my watch, I'd been asleep for almost 8 hours, the longest stretch of rest I'd had in weeks. I felt better than I had in days, alert and refreshed in a way that surprised me. The other me was standing beside my truck, still wearing the same clothes, still sporting the same tired smile. But something was different about him in the daylight. His skin had a waxy quality, like old candle wax that had been molded and shaped, and his eyes, while still the same color as mine, seemed flat and lifeless, like painted glass. Feel better? He asked as I rolled down the window. Yeah, actually. Thanks for keeping watch. No problem. He paused, studying me with those strange flat eyes. You know we should stick together. Same route, same company. Might as well convoy. The suggestion made sense from a practical standpoint. Truckers often travel together for safety and companionship, watching each other's backs on the long, lonely highways. But something about the idea filled me with dread, a cold certainty that accepting his offer would be a terrible mistake. I don't know, I said slowly. I usually prefer to drive alone. His smile didn't change, but something shifted in his expression, a subtle hardening around the eyes. Come on, Marcus, we're practically the same person. Who better to travel with than yourself? The way he said my name sent chills down my spine. I hadn't told him what it was, and while it might have been written on my company ID or somewhere on the truck, the casual familiarity with which he used it felt wrong, like a violation of something fundamental. I really should get going, I said, starting my engine. The diesel rumbled to life, and the familiar vibration through the seats was oddly comforting. Sure, he said, stepping back from the truck. See you down the road. I pulled out of the rest stop quickly, perhaps too quickly, my tires spinning slightly on the loose gravel. In my mirrors, I could see him standing there watching me leave, perfectly still, until the crimson trail from Marcus. The highway stretched before me like a black ribbon under the pale moonlight, and I'd been driving this route between Portland and Sacramento for nearly 15 years without incident. My Peterbilt 379 hummed its familiar diesel lullaby as I settled into the rhythm of night driving, the kind of meditative trance that comes naturally after years behind the wheel. The radio crackled softly with distant conversations between drivers scattered across the interstate, their voices a comforting reminder that I wasn't entirely alone out here in the darkness. It was just past 2 in the morning when I first noticed something peculiar on the asphalt ahead. My headlights swept across what appeared to be tire marks, but these weren't the usual black rubber streaks you'd expect from a hard brake or blown tire. These marks had an odd, glistening quality that caught the light strangely, almost as if they were wet despite the clear, dry night. I slowed my rig slightly, leaning forward to get a better look through the windshield, my hands instinctively tightening on the steering wheel. The marks ran straight down the center of the right lane for maybe 50 yards before veering sharply toward the shoulder and disappearing into the darkness beyond my headlights' reach. What struck me as unusual wasn't just their odd appearance, but their color. Even in the limited illumination of my truck's beams, they appeared to have a reddish tint that seemed to pulse and shift in the moving light. I'd seen plenty of tire marks in my years on the road, from emergency stops to accidents, but nothing quite like these. As I passed over them, I felt a slight vibration through the steering wheel, a subtle tremor that seemed to travel up through the truck's frame. The sensation lasted only a moment, but it left me with an inexplicable sense of unease. I checked my mirrors automatically, scanning for any sign of trouble, but the highway behind me remained empty save for a distant pair of headlights that had been following at a respectful distance for the past hour. The radio chatter continued in the background, drivers discussing weather conditions ahead and good coffee stops, but I found myself only half listening. My attention kept drifting back to those strange tire marks, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something about them was fundamentally wrong. The reddish color bothered me most of all. In all my years of trucking, I'd never seen rubber leave marks of that particular hue. About 10 miles down the road I encountered them again. This time, the marks appeared fresher somehow, more vivid in their strange crimson coloration. They formed a different pattern too, weaving slightly back and forth across the lane, as if the vehicle that made them had been struggling to maintain control. The marks were wider here, suggesting a larger truck, possibly even bigger than my own rig. As my headlights illuminated them, I could swear I saw them glisten with moisture, as if they were somehow still wet. I reached for my CB radio, intending to ask if any other drivers had noticed these peculiar marks, but something made me hesitate. The night felt different somehow, charged with a tension I couldn't quite identify. The familiar comfort of the highway had been replaced by something else. something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, despite the warm air circulating through the cab. The third time I encountered the tire marks, they were so fresh they appeared to be steaming in the cool night air. My headlights revealed them with startling clarity now, and there was no mistaking their color. They weren't just reddish, they were definitely red, a deep crimson that seemed almost organic in nature. The marks stretched across both lanes this time, forming an erratic zigzag pattern that spoke of desperation, of a driver fighting against some unknown force. I brought my truck to a gradual stop, pulling over to the shoulder with my hazard lights flashing. The engine's idle seemed unusually loud in the sudden stillness, and I could hear the tick of cooling metal as I climbed down from the cab. The night air was crisp and carried the usual highway sense of diesel fuel and hot asphalt, but underneath those familiar smells was something else, something metallic and organic that made my stomach turn slightly. Walking back toward the tire marks with my flashlight, I could see them clearly now in the concentrated beam. They weren't just red, they were actively bleeding. Thick, viscous liquid seeped slowly from the asphalt where the marks had been burned into the road surface, pooling in small crimson puddles that reflected my flashlight beam like dark mirrors. The sight was so impossible, so at odds with everything I understood about physics and reality, that I stood there for several long minutes, just staring. It had the consistency and color of blood, but something about it felt wrong, ancient somehow, as if it had been seeping from some deep wound in the earth itself. When I lifted my finger, a thin strand of the substance stretched between my skin and the pooled liquid on the asphalt, finally breaking to fall back to the road with a soft dripping sound. It was still distant, but approaching fast, the deep rumble of a heavy diesel engine pushed to its limits. I looked up from the bleeding tire marks to see headlights cresting a hill about a mile behind me. But these weren't the steady white or yellow beams of normal truck light. These headlights pulsed with the same deep red as the tire marks, casting an eerie crimson glow across the highway that seemed to consume the darkness rather than illuminate it. There was something wrong with the sound it made, a grinding, tortured quality that spoke of machinery pushed far beyond its design limit. As I reached my cab and hauled myself up into the driver's seat, I could hear other sounds mixed with the diesel roar, the screech of metal on metal, the rhythmic thump of tires that seemed to be coming apart, and underneath it all something that sounded almost like scream. My hands shook as I shifted into gear and pulled back onto the highway, pushing my own engine harder than I normally would. In my mirrors, those red headlights were gaining ground with impossible speed, and I could now make out the silhouette of the truck behind them. It was massive, larger than any commercial vehicle I'd ever seen, with a profile that seemed somehow wrong, as if it had been stretched and twisted into an unnatural shape. The screaming sound was definitely coming from the approaching truck now, a high-pitched wail that seemed to cut through the night air like a blade. It wasn't mechanical noise, I realized with growing horror. It was human voices, multiple voices crying out in agony and desperation, somehow emanating from the truck itself as it bore down on me with relentless determination. In my side mirror I could see it more clearly now, and the sight made my blood run cold. The truck's trailer wasn't carrying cargo containers or freight. Instead, it appeared to be constructed of twisted metal and dark glass, through which I could see shapes moving in the red glow of its headlights. Human shapes pressed against the glass from the inside, their mouths open in silent screams that somehow became audible as that terrible wailing sound. The truck pulled alongside me in the left lane, matching my speed exactly, and I could feel the heat radiating from its engine, even through my closed windows. The driver's cab was positioned high above my own, but when I looked up I couldn't see anyone behind the wheel. The windows were tinted so dark they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating the impression of empty voids where a driver should be. The phantom truck's tires left those same bleeding marks on the asphalt, trails of crimson that stretched behind us like wounds in the road itself. The screaming from its trailer continued unabated, a chorus of agony that seemed to bypass my ears and burrow directly into my brain. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the truck began to fade, not slow down or pull away, but literally become translucent, as if it were being slowly erased from existence. The screaming faded with it, becoming first an echo, then a whisper, then silent. Within moments I was alone the highway again, my own engine the only sound in the night. I drove for another hour before stopping at a truck stop, where I sat in the parking lot with the engine running and all my lights on, afraid to turn them on. Other drivers came and went, normal people in normal trucks, going about their normal business. I wanted to ask them about the bleeding tire marks, about the phantom truck with its cargo of screaming souls, but how do you explain something like that without sounding insane? When dawn finally broke, I continued my route to Sacramento, delivering my cargo on schedule as if nothing had happened. The last laugh on Channel 19. From Jake Morrison, the CB crackled to life. Just as I was pulling into the rest stop outside Bakersfield, the static cutting through the low hum of my Kenworth's engine like a knife through silk. I'd been driving for 14 hours straight, hauling a load of refrigerated produce from Salinas to Phoenix, and my eyes felt like sandpaper against glass. The dashboard clock glowed a pale green 3:47 a.m., and the world outside my windshield was nothing but endless California darkness, punctuated by the occasional flicker of distant truck stop neon. Breaker 19. "This is Moondog looking for a westbound Smoky report," came the voice through the radio, smooth and friendly in that particular way that long-haul drivers develop after years of talking to strangers across the airwaves. I adjusted my grip on the steering wheel and reached for the handset, grateful for any human contact in the lonely pre-dawn hours. "Moondog, this is Desert Rose coming back at you," I replied, using the handle I'd carried for the better part of 15 years running freight across the Southwest. "Roads clean and green from Bakersfield to the Grapevine, good buddy. What's your 20? About 10 miles behind you, Desert Rose. Say, you got your ears on for a good joke? Got one that'll tickle your funny bone, but good." I smiled despite the fatigue that seemed to seep into my bones like cold fog. CB humor was usually pretty rough around the edges, the kind of jokes that would make a sailor blush. But there was something comforting about the ritual of it all. Drivers sharing stories and laughs across the miles, connected by nothing but radio waves, and the shared experience of life on the road. "Go ahead and lay it on me, Moondog." Lord knows I could use a chuckle. The voice that came back was warm with anticipation, like someone settling into a favorite chair by a fireplace. "All right, Desert Rose, here goes. Why did the chicken cross the playground?" I keyed the mic, playing along with the familiar call and response. "I don't know, Moondog. Why did the chicken cross the playground?" To get to the other slide, the laughter that followed was rich and genuine, the kind that makes you want to laugh along even if the joke wasn't particularly funny. There was something infectious about his mirth, and I found myself chuckling as I pulled my rig into a parking space between two other semis. "That's terrible, good buddy," I said, still smiling. "You got any more where that came from?" "Oh, I got plenty more, Desert Rose. How about this one? What do you call a sleeping bull at a truck stop?" The game continued as I shut down my engine, the sudden silence almost jarring after 14 hours of road noise and diesel rumble. Outside my window, the rest stop was bathed in the sickly yellow glow of sodium lights, casting everything in sharp shadows and pale highlights. A few other trucks were scattered around the lot, their drivers presumably catching some much-needed rest in their sleepers. "I give up, Moondog. What do you call a sleeping bull at a truck stop?" "A bulldozer." Again, that warm, infectious laughter filled my cab, and I found myself genuinely enjoying this midnight comedian's routine. It had been weeks since I'd had a good conversation on the CB. Most drivers these days preferring their cell phones and satellite radios to the old Channel 19 community. We traded jokes for the better part of an hour, each one more elaborate than the last. Moondog seemed to have an endless supply, ranging from the genuinely clever to the wonderfully groan-worthy. There was something oddly hypnotic about his voice, a cadence that made the time slip by unnoticed. The fatigue that had been pressing down on me like a lead blanket seemed to lift, replaced by an almost euphoric sense of connection and camaraderie. "All right, Desert Rose, I got one more for you," Moondog said, his voice taking on a slightly different quality. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. This one's special. Saved it for last. You ready? Lay it on me. Good buddy. What's the difference between a dead driver on the side of the road and a dead CB comedian? Something cold crawled up my spine, a premonition that made my hand hesitate over the microphone. The question hung in the air like smoke, and suddenly the warm camaraderie of the past hour felt different, tainted somehow. But I'd come this far, and backing out of a joke seemed almost superstitious. The laughter that followed wasn't warm anymore. It was sharp and brittle, like glass breaking in slow motion, and it seemed to go on far longer than any human laugh should. As it continued, stretching into something that couldn't possibly be coming from human lungs, I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice water in my vein. The same 3 semis that had been parked when I arrived were still the only other vehicles in the lot, and their drivers were clearly asleep, cabs dark and quiet. I grabbed the handset with shaking hands, my mouth dry as desert sand. Moondog, what's your 20? Moondog, come back. Nothing but static answered me, the white noise filling my cab like the whisper of distant grave. I tried again, cycling through different channels, but the radio had gone completely dead. Not just quiet, dead, as if someone had reached inside and torn out its electronic heart. The rest stop was exactly as it had been an hour ago, exactly as it should be at 4:30 in the morning. Yellow lights hummed and flickered, casting their sickly glow over empty parking spaces and shuttered buildings. Nothing moved except the distant flutter of a torn plastic bag caught on a fence post. But something was wrong with the silence. It was too complete, too perfect. No highway noise reached us here, though Interstate 5 was less than a quarter-mile away. No insect sounds, no wind, nothing but my own breathing and the rapid hammer of my heartbeat in my ear. I walked toward the building, thinking maybe I could find another driver, someone else who might have heard the broadcast, but my footsteps seemed to echo wrong, as if the sound was being absorbed by something invisible in the air around me. The convenience store windows were dark, but as I approached I could see my reflection multiplied in the glass, distorted and strange. That's when I saw it, written in the dust on the window. Thanks for playing along, Desert Rose. The joke's on you now. I backed away from the building, every instinct screaming at me to get back to my truck, to get back on the road, to put as much distance as possible between myself and this place. But as I turned, I realized that the other trucks were gone, all of them. I was alone in the lot with my Kenworth, surrounded by empty parking spaces that showed no sign anyone had ever been there at all. The CB in my truck crackled to life as I climbed back into the cab, Moondog's voice filling the space like poison gas. Where you going, Desert Rose? We ain't finished yet. I got one more joke for you, the best one of all. He ignored the radio, firing up my engine and throwing the truck into gear. The transmission whined in protest as I accelerated too quickly, but I didn't care. I needed to get moving, needed to get back to the familiar rhythm of road and distance and the steady progression of mile markers ticking by. What do you call a driver who thinks he can outrun the punchline? Moondog's voice followed me out of the parking lot, somehow coming through my dead radio speakers. Mile after mile rolled beneath my wheels, and slowly the oppressive silence gave way to normal road sounds, normal radio chatter, normal life. By the time I reached Bakersfield, I had almost convinced myself it had all been a hallucination, brought on by fatigue and too many hours alone on the road. Almost. But even now, months later, I can't bring myself to key up on Channel 19 after midnight. And sometimes, in the small hours when the road stretches endless and dark ahead of my headlights, I hear that laughter echoing from my speakers, and I know that somewhere out there, Moondog is still telling jokes to drivers who think they're just looking for a friendly voice in the darkness. I never did hear the punchline. The Dead Route Protocol, from Marcus Chan. I'd been running the stretch of California desert for 12 years, knew every truck stop, every way station, every place where the highway patrol liked to hide behind the overpass shadows. The familiar green glow of the dispatch screen cut through the darkness of my Peterbilt's cab like a lighthouse beacon, and I reached for it with the automatic motion of a driver who'd answered 10,000 such calls. New pickup in Victorville, Warehouse District, Building 47 on Industrial Boulevard. Standard freight, destination Phoenix. Nothing unusual there except for the route number at the bottom of the screen. Route 127D. I stared at those numbers and felt something cold settle in my stomach. Route 127 had been discontinued 8 months ago when a driver named Jimmy Kowalski jackknifed his rig, trying to avoid something in the road. Never found out what he was swerving to miss. Jimmy walked away from that crash, but he never drove again. Said he couldn't shake the feeling that something had been calling to him from the darkness beyond his headlights. The desert wind whistled through the slight gap in my passenger window, carrying with it the scent of sage and something else, something metallic and bitter. I tried raising dispatch on the CB, but got nothing but static that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat. The Qualcomm showed full signal strength, so I typed back a confirmation request, asking about the route designation. The response came immediately. Proceed to pickup. Route 127D active. Time-sensitive delivery. My hands hesitated over the keyboard. Every fiber of professional experience told me to clarify, to double-check, to make sure this wasn't some computer glitch. But the fuel gauge was running low, and a paying load was a paying load. The desert economy didn't leave much room for superstition, even when that superstition came wrapped in the kind of coincidence that made the hair on your arms stand up. The warehouse district squatted in the industrial belly of the city, all corrugated metal buildings and empty parking lots, surrounded by chain-link fence. Building 47 sat at the end of a dead-end street, its loading dock bathed in the sickly yellow glow of sodium vapor light. A single figure in a reflective vest stood waiting, clipboard in hand, breath visible in the cool morning air. When I asked about the cargo, he just shrugged and said it was machine parts, headed for a manufacturing plant in Phoenix. The trailer sealed up tight, certification tags properly attached, gross weight well within legal limit. Everything by the book, except for the way the man kept glancing over his shoulder at the empty street behind us. "You ever run Route 127 before?" he asked, as I signed the delivery receipt. "Old 127 got shut down," I replied. "This is 127D, first time." He nodded slowly, like he was digesting something unpleasant. "Well, stick to the route they give you. Don't take any shortcuts, especially through Ludlow. That stretch of road," he paused, shook his head. "Just stick to the route." The Qualcomm chirped again as I pulled out of the lot. New routing instructions, detailed mile markers, and turn-by-turn directions that would take me south on 15, then east on a series of increasingly smaller highways that skirted the Mojave National Preserve. It was a longer route than I would have chosen, adding maybe 3 hours to the drive, but the fuel surcharge made up for the lost time. I settled into the familiar rhythm of highway driving, watching the sun climb higher over the desert landscape. The first sign that something wasn't right came about 50 miles out of Victorville. The CB radio, which had been picking up the usual chatter of drivers comparing fuel prices and warning about Smokey Bears, went completely silent. Not static, not squelch, just an absence of sound that seemed to press against my eardrums. I tried switching channels, adjusting the squelch, even checking the antenna connection, but nothing helped. The radio was working perfectly, there just wasn't anyone out there to talk to. The Qualcomm updated my route twice more, each revision taking me further from the main highways and deeper into the empty heart of the desert. The roads grew narrower, the pavement older, until I was following a 2-lane strip of asphalt that looked like it hadn't been maintained since the 60s. The landscape outside my windshield took on an otherworldly quality, all twisted Joshua trees and red rock formations that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. I stopped for a mandatory rest break at a truck stop that shouldn't have been there. According to my GPS, I was in the middle of nowhere, but there it was. A small cluster of buildings with fuel pumps and a diner that advertised world-famous pie in neon letters that flickered erratically in the growing heat of the day. The place was empty, except for an elderly woman behind the counter who served me coffee that tasted like it had been sitting on the burner since morning. "You're on the old route," she said, not really a question. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Something about the way she looked at me, with a mixture of pity and resignation, made my throat feel dry despite the coffee. "Most drivers don't come through here anymore. Not since." She gestured vaguely at the empty parking lot. "You be careful out there. Sometimes the road remembers things that are better left forgotten." Back in the truck, the Qualcomm showed another message. "Maintain current route. Delivery window critical. Do not deviate." The timestamp on the message was wrong, showing a date 8 months in the past. I tried to flag the error, but the system wouldn't accept my input. The screen flickered once, briefly showing what looked like a different message entirely. Something about Jimmy Kowalski and a final delivery, before returning to the routing instruction. The afternoon wore on, and the landscape outside grew stranger. Dead trees lined the roadway, their bare branches reaching across the asphalt like skeletal fingers. The pavement itself seemed wrong somehow, newer in some spots than others, as if sections had been recently repaired or replaced. I began to notice patterns in the repairs, long straight gouges in the asphalt that looked almost like skid marks, all leading to the same spot about a quarter-mile ahead. That's when I saw the other truck. It was sitting in the median, a Kenworth conventional with Colorado plates, tilted at an angle that suggested a blown tire or mechanical failure. The cab was dark, no sign of the driver, but something about the scene made me slow down and pull onto the shoulder. Professional courtesy demanded that I at least check if whoever was driving needed help or a ride to the nearest town. The cab was empty, but the keys were still in the ignition, and there was a Qualcomm unit mounted on the dashboard showing an active message. I couldn't make out all the details through the tinted glass, but I could see enough to recognize the same route designation that had been haunting my own dispatch all day. Route 27D. Inside, the cargo space was completely empty except for tie-down straps that had been cut rather than properly released. On the floor, barely visible in the shadows, was a clipboard with delivery papers that bore a familiar signature. Jimmy Kowalski had been here. Maybe recently, maybe 8 months ago. In the desert heat and preservation of the dry air, it was impossible to tell. I heard the rumble of a diesel engine and turned to see my own truck's exhaust stack belching black smoke into the clear desert air. The engine was running, but I had turned it off before walking over to investigate. I ran back across the highway, my heart hammering against my ribs, and yanked open the driver's door. The cab was exactly as I had left it, except for the Qualcomm screen, which was now displaying a message I had never seen before. Final delivery completed. Route 27D permanently retired. Proceed to terminal for debrief. But I wasn't anywhere near a terminal, and my delivery was still loaded in the trailer behind me. I tried to radio for help, tried to call dispatch on my cell phone, but the silence that had followed me all day seemed to have deepened. Even the desert wind had stopped, leaving an absolute stillness that pressed against my consciousness like a physical weight. The sun was beginning to set when I finally got back on the road. The mirror that wouldn't break, from Jake Morrison. The crack in my rearview mirror had been there for 3 months, running like a jagged lightning bolt from the upper left corner down to the center of the glass. It happened on a run through Colorado when a rock kicked up from the highway and struck it with a sound like a gunshot. I kept meaning to replace it, but trucking schedules don't leave much time for maintenance that isn't absolutely critical, and I could still see well enough through the fractured reflection to keep my rig safe on the road. What bothered me wasn't the crack itself, but how the mirror seemed to be getting worse in ways that didn't make sense. Each morning when I climbed into the cab of my Peterbilt, that crack appeared to have grown longer, deeper, more complex. New spiderweb fractures branched out from the original damage, creating a maze of silver lines that caught the light in strange ways. By the time I reached the truck stop outside Amarillo on that cold November evening, The entire surface looked ready to shatter at the slightest vibration. The wind was picking up as I pulled into my usual spot at the back of the lot, away from the main building's harsh fluorescent glow. My air brakes hissed their familiar sigh as I settled in for my mandatory rest period, and I reached up to adjust the mirror for a final check of the space behind me. The moment my fingers touched the mounting bracket, I expected to hear the tinkle of falling glass, expected to see the mirror finally give up its precarious hold and scatter across my dashboard. Through all those cracks and fractures, I could see the familiar outlines of other trucks parked nearby, their running lights creating small pools of amber and red in the darkness. But there was something else, something that shouldn't have been there. A figure stood between two trailers about 50 feet behind me, perfectly still facing my truck. The space between those trailers was empty except for scattered litter and a small puddle reflecting the yellow sodium lights overhead. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was still there, clearer now despite the fractured glass. It appeared to be a woman in what looked like a long coat or dress, her hair hanging loose around her face. She wasn't moving, just standing there as if waiting for something. The reasonable part of my mind insisted this was just an optical illusion created by the broken mirror, some trick of light and shadow twisted by the damaged glass into the suggestion of a human form. Mirrors could play all sorts of tricks, especially damaged ones, and I'd been driving for 14 hours straight. Fatigue could make anyone see things that weren't really there. But as I watched, the figure raised one arm in what might have been a wave or a gesture of beckoning. The movement was slow and deliberate, and when she lowered her arm, she took a single step forward. Even through the maze of cracks, I could see that she was now closer to my truck, though when I turned to look directly behind me, there was still nothing there but empty pavement and shadows. I decided to test my theory about the damaged mirror by giving it a firm tap with my knuckle. The impact should have been enough to finally bring the whole thing down, or at least shake loose some of the more precarious fragments. Instead, the glass held together as if it were brand new, not even vibrating under the force of my knock. The spider web of cracks seemed to pulse for a moment, like a network of silver veins carrying some kind of strange energy, and then settled back into their usual pattern. The woman in the reflection had moved again. She was halfway across the space now, still approaching my truck with that same unhurried pace. Her face was becoming clearer as she drew nearer, and what I could see of her expression filled me with a growing unease. Her eyes appeared to be fixed directly on the mirror, as if she could see me watching her through the fractured glass. There was something hungry in that gaze, something patient and predatory that made my hands shake as I gripped the steering wheel. I reached for my CB radio and tuned to channel 19, hoping to raise another driver who might be able to take a look at the area behind my truck. The radio crackled to life with the usual chatter of late-night haulers, sharing information about road conditions and speed traps. But when I tried to transmit, no one seemed to hear me. My voice carried clearly through the cab, but the other drivers continued their conversations as if I hadn't spoken at all. Her clothing looked old-fashioned, like something from decades past, and there was a strange quality to the way the light fell on her, as if she were illuminated by a source I couldn't identify. Most disturbing of all, she appeared to be walking not on the pavement behind my truck, but on some other surface entirely, something that put her at a slightly different level than the parking lot around her. I decided I needed to get out of the cab and confront whatever was happening, whether it was a real person playing some kind of elaborate prank, or a manifestation of my own exhausted imagination. But when I reached for the door handle, my hand passed right through it as if it weren't there at all. I tried again, more forcefully, but my fingers found only empty air where solid metal should have been. Panic began to rise in my chest as I realized I couldn't feel the seat beneath me either, or the steering wheel under my palms. The woman was almost at my truck now, close enough that I should have been able to hear her footsteps on the pavement, but the night remained silent, except for the distant hum of other trucks' auxiliary power units, and the whisper of wind through the parking lot. She reached out one hand toward what would have been the rear of my trailer, and as her fingers made contact with the metal, I felt a corresponding touch on my shoulder, cold and light as a spider's web. In that moment of contact, I understood with terrible clarity what was happening. The mirror wasn't just broken, it was showing me something that existed in the spaces between the cracks, in the gaps where reality had been fractured and twisted into something else entirely. The woman wasn't behind my truck at all. She was inside the mirror, trapped in the maze of silver lines and broken reflections, and she had been waiting for someone to see her clearly enough to make contact. As her touch grew stronger on my shoulder, I felt myself being drawn backward, pulled away from my physical body and toward the fractured surface of the mirror. The cab around me began to fade, becoming translucent and insubstantial, while the reflection in the broken glass grew more solid and real. I could see myself now from the outside, sitting in the driver's seat with my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, my face growing pale and slack as something vital was drawn out of me. The woman smiled, and in that expression I saw the faces of others who had been caught by broken mirror, pulled into the spaces between reflections, where distance and direction meant nothing, where up could be down and forward could be backward, where the only constant was the hunger of those who had been trapped there longest. She was welcoming me to join them in their eternal vigil, waiting behind fractured glass for the next traveler to see them clearly enough to make the crossing possible. With a tremendous effort of will, I forced myself to look away from the mirror and toward the solid reality of my truck's interior. The CB radio was still crackling with conversation, the dashboard lights still glowed their familiar colors, and the worn fabric of the driver's seat was rough and warm under my hand. I was still here, still in the physical world, though I could feel the pull of the broken mirror trying to draw me back. In the mirror I could see the woman standing where my truck had been parked, no longer approaching but not retreating either, just watching as I put distance between us. The cracks in the glass seemed to be healing themselves as I drove, the spider web of fractures closing up and disappearing until the mirror looked almost normal again. There's still a thin line running through the center, barely visible unless you know where to look for it. And sometimes, in the right light and at the right angle, I can still see movement in that reflection, shadows that don't quite match the world behind me. I've learned not to look too closely or for too long, because I know she's still there, still waiting, still patient. The mirror may look solid now, but I know it's fragile as spun glass, ready to fracture again at the slightest impact. And I'm starting to think that maybe that's exactly what she's waiting for. The Midnight Circuit. From Marcus Chentaya. The CB radio crackled to life at exactly 11:47 p.m., same as it had every night for the past month. Static filled my cab, then cleared to reveal that familiar voice, smooth as old leather and twice as worn. "Evening, Marcus. Ready for another run?" I should have turned off the radio right then, should have pulled into the next truck stop, and waited for dawn. But the voice somehow made it sound like the most natural thing in the world. My hand moved to the CB handset without my permission, and I heard myself respond, "Copy that, dispatch. Route 49 North. Same as always." The thing is, I'd never worked for any company that used that call sign. Hell, I'd been an owner-operator for 15 years, running freight up and down the Pacific Northwest on my own schedule, answering to nobody but myself and the bills that kept piling up. But every night after midnight, when the highways emptied and the world grew dim, that voice would find me wherever I was. And somehow I'd end up on the same stretch of Route 49, hauling a trailer I didn't remember hooking up, following the same endless loop through mountains I couldn't find on any map. The first time it happened, I chalked it up to exhaustion. 70-hour weeks will scramble anyone's brain, and I'd been pushing hard to make enough for the down payment on a house Sarah had been wanting. We'd been saving for 3 years, living in that cramped apartment above the diner, dreaming of a white picket fence and a place to finally call home. The second time, I figured maybe I'd picked up some strange regional dispatch frequency, some local outfit running late-night route. But by the third time, when I found myself on that same winding mountain road with no memory of how I'd gotten there, I started to understand that something was very, very wrong. The road itself defies explanation. Route 49 officially ends about 200 miles south of where I find myself each night, terminating at a junction with Interstate 5 near a town called Grants Pass. But the Route 49 I drive after midnight stretches on for what feels like hundreds of miles, winding through pine forests so dense they swallow my headlights, past lakes that reflect starlight like black mirrors, over bridges that span gorges deeper than my high beams can penetrate. The asphalt is perfect, smooth as glass, with bright yellow lines that seem to glow with their own inner light. No potholes, no construction, no roadkill, nothing to suggest that any other vehicle has ever used this route. My rig purrs along this phantom highway like it's floating on air. The engine runs too quietly, the suspension too smooth, as if the laws of physics have been gently suspended for my benefit. Even the diesel gauge barely moves, though I should be burning fuel at my usual rate of 6 miles per gallon. The speedometer holds steady at exactly 65 miles per hour, no matter how I adjust the throttle. When I try to slow down, the engine maintains its rhythm, and when I floor it, nothing changes. It's like being on cruise control that I never set and can't disengage. The CB continues to crackle with communications throughout the night, but they're not conversations I recognize. The voices are professional, calm, discussing loads and delivery times, weather conditions and route changes, but they reference cities I've never heard of and use 10 codes that don't match any system I know. Sometimes I hear my own voice among them, confirming pickup times and reporting my position, though I'm never consciously keying the microphone. It's like listening to a parallel version of myself, one who belongs on this road, who has always belonged here. Around 2 a.m., the landmarks begin to repeat. There's a distinctive rock formation that juts out over the road like a stone wave frozen mid-crash, and I've counted it 17 times now, appearing at regular intervals along my route. Each time I pass it, my trailer's running lights flicker in a pattern I can't decode. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short again, like some automotive distress signal. A few miles after the rock formation, there's always a scenic overlook, empty except for a single picnic table that sits at an impossible angle, one leg hanging over a cliff that seems to extend down into absolute void. Mile markers flash by in sequence, but they're counting down instead of up, starting from 500 and decreasing with each passing mile, as if measuring the distance to somewhere I don't want to go. I see them in my mirror sometimes, following at a respectful distance, running lights cutting through the mountain darkness. When I glimpse them in the strobing illumination of deer crossing signs, they look normal enough, standard big rigs that could belong to any freight company. But when I try to get a better look, when I adjust my mirrors or crane my neck to see out the side windows, they're never quite where I expect them to be. They drift between lanes without signaling, maintain speeds that don't match their apparent distance, and their headlights cast shadows that fall in the wrong directions, as if the light is coming from somewhere else entirely. I've pulled over and shut off the engine, only to find myself rolling again, minutes later with the key turned and the diesel rumbling. I've attempted to exit at the few off-ramps I've spotted, but the steering wheel becomes unresponsive as I approach, and my truck drifts past the exit as smoothly as if it were painted on the road. Once, in desperation, I tried to jackknife the trailer on purpose, cranking the wheel hard to the right while hitting the brakes, but the rig simply continued its steady progress down the center line as if my input meant nothing. Around 5 a.m., according to my dashboard clock, though the sky remains the same star-studded black it's been all night, the CB voice returns. "Excellent run tonight, Marcus. Same time tomorrow." And before I can respond, before I can demand answers or explanations, or just scream my frustration into the microphone, the world begins to fade around the edges. The perfect asphalt grows misty, the pine trees blur into green-black smears, and the mountains dissolve like sugar in rain. My truck shudders, the engine coughs back to its familiar rough idle, and suddenly I'm sitting in a parking lot or on a roadside, always somewhere different, always somewhere I don't remember stopping, with the sun rising over an ordinary landscape, and traffic beginning to thicken on normal highway. But here I am again, and it's 11:47 p.m., and the CB is crackling to life, with that leather-smooth voice asking if I'm ready for another run. My logbook shows yesterday's miles, yesterday's route, as if the night journey never happened. The fuel gauge reads exactly what it should. The odometer hasn't advanced by those phantom miles. And if I called the Department of Transportation to report a strange road, they'd probably send me for a drug test. Yet I can feel it starting again. The subtle shift in the engine's rhythm, the gradual changes in the dashboard lighting, the way the road ahead begins to look just a little too perfect in my headlights. Sarah called 3 hours ago, wondering when I'd be home, and I told her I'd be back Thursday like always. But I'm starting to fear that Thursday might never come, that I'm trapped in this endless circuit of midnight miles, following a route that exists only in the hours when the world sleeps. The CB voice is patient, almost kindly, but underneath that professional courtesy, I sense something vast and hungry, something that feeds on distance and time, and the space between heartbeats. Each night the loop feels a little longer, the landmarks a little more familiar, and I wonder if eventually the dawn will forget to come for me entirely, leaving me to drive forever through these mountain shadows, that taste of pine and eternity. The speedometer reads 65, steady as always, and the mile markers continue their countdown towards something I dare not imagine. Exit that tastes like ash. From Marcus, the taste started somewhere around mile marker 207. Just a hint of something bitter coating my tongue like I'd been chewing on burnt coffee grounds. I rolled down the window of my Kenworth and spat into the Nevada darkness, but the flavor clung to my mouth like smoke clings to fabric. The CB radio crackled with static and distant voices, truckers calling out their 20 locations and warning about speed traps ahead. I reached for my water bottle and took a long pull, but even the cool liquid couldn't wash away that growing taste of ash. I'd been running this route between Reno and Vegas for 8 years, knew every truck stop and every curve of asphalt like the lines on my own palm. The desert stretched endlessly on both sides of Interstate 80, dotted with the occasional cluster of lights that marked some forgotten town. My headlights carved through the November night, illuminating the reflective strips on the guardrail that flashed past like a strobe. The engine hummed its familiar song beneath me, a steady diesel heartbeat that usually lulled me into the meditative state that made these long hauls bearable. The ash taste grew stronger with each passing mile, accompanied by an odd pressure in my ears like I was gaining altitude even though the highway remained flat. I checked my CB again, switching through the channels, but all I got was that same crackling static. Even the usual chatter from the late-night crowd had gone quiet. The digital clock on my dashboard read 2:34 a.m., that dead hour when the world feels most empty and strange. That's when I saw the exit sign, exit 251B. The strange thing was, I'd never seen it before. 8 years of running this exact route, and there was no exit 251B. I knew 251A led to a cluster of gas stations and a little diner that served decent coffee. Exit 252 was 15 miles ahead and took you to an abandoned mining town that had been empty since the 1970s. But 251B, that was impossible. The sign looked official enough, weathered green metal with white reflective letters just like all the other. But as I drew closer, I noticed something odd about the letters themselves. They seemed to shimmer and dance in my headlights, as if the words were written in heat waves rising from summer asphalt. The taste of ash in my mouth intensified, and I found myself slowing down despite every instinct telling me to keep driving. The off-ramp curved away into the desert darkness, disappearing behind a low hill dotted with Joshua tree. No lights were visible beyond the curve, no indication of what might lie at the end of that particular road. I should have kept going, should have pushed down on the accelerator and put that impossible exit in my rearview mirror. But something compelled me to take it, some combination of curiosity and the increasingly unbearable taste of ash that made my jaw ache. The off-ramp was paved but narrow, clearly not designed for tractor-trailers. My trailer swayed slightly as I navigated the curve, and I had to be careful not to let the tandems drift off the asphalt. The road beyond the curve was stranger still, a perfectly straight line that stretched toward what looked like a cluster of buildings, maybe 2 miles ahead. But the buildings were dark, just black silhouettes against the star-filled sky. As I drove closer, the taste of ash became so strong, I started to gag. It was like breathing in the remains of a house fire, that acrid combination of burned wood and melted plastic, and things that were never meant to burn. I rolled up my window, thinking maybe the smell was coming from outside, but that only made it worse. The taste seemed to be coming from inside my own lungs, as if I'd been breathing smoke for hours. The buildings resolved themselves into a small town as I approached, and that's when things got truly strange. It looked like any of a dozen desert communities I'd passed through over the years. A gas station, a diner, a few houses scattered along a main street that probably hadn't seen fresh paint in decades. But every single building was dark, not just closed for the night dark, but abandoned dark, empty dark. The kind of darkness that only comes to places where people used to live but don't anymore. The building looked like it had been frozen in time somewhere around 1985, with old-style pumps and faded signs advertising cigarette brands that didn't exist anymore. But everything was intact, as if the residents had simply vanished one day and left everything exactly as it was. A newspaper dispenser stood by the door, and I could see papers still inside, though the text on the front page was too faded to read from my cab. Even my truck's engine seemed muffled, as if the sound was being absorbed by the darkness around me. I thought about getting out to stretch my legs, maybe see if there was a working restroom, but something kept me in my seat. The taste of ash had become overwhelming, coating my throat and making it hard to swallow. That's when I noticed the smoke. It wasn't visible at first, just a subtle haze that made the starlight seem dimmer. But as I watched, it grew thicker, rising from somewhere behind the main street buildings. Not the black smoke of a fire, but something pale and gray that moved with deliberate purpose, rather than drifting on air current. The smoke flowed between the buildings like water, pooling in doorways and flowing across the empty street. I started my engine, suddenly desperate to leave, but the truck wouldn't respond. The starter cranked and the engine turned over, but it wouldn't catch. The taste of ash filled my mouth so completely now that I could barely breathe. The smoke had reached my truck, flowing around the cab like fog, but fog that moved with intelligence and intention. Through the gray haze, I began to see shapes moving in the empty buildings. Not people exactly, but human-shaped shadows that passed behind broken windows and open doorways. They moved with the same purposeful flow as the smoke, and I realized with growing horror that they were moving toward my truck. The shadows had no features I could make out, just vaguely human silhouettes that seemed to be made of the same pale smoke that filled the air. My truck's engine finally caught, roaring to life with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the dead silence. I threw it into gear and spun the wheel, not caring about the tight turn radius or the risk of jackknife. The trailer swung wide, narrowly missing one of the old gas pumps, and I gunned it toward the road leading back to the highway. In my mirrors I could see the smoke pursuing me, flowing across the ground faster than any natural fog should move. The shadow figures were part of it now, dark shapes swimming through the pale gray like sharks through cloudy water. They moved with purpose and hunger, and I knew without knowing how that they wanted whatever it was that made me alive and warm and real. The road back to the highway stretched endlessly ahead, much longer than it had seemed on the way in. My speedometer showed 60, then 70, then 80 miles per hour, dangerous speeds for a fully loaded truck on an unknown road, but the smoke in my mirrors was keeping pace. The taste of ash was so strong now that I was choking on it, my eyes watering as if I'd been standing downwind of a campfire. The familiar glow of the highway, the red taillights of other vehicles, the blessed normalcy of civilization and movement and life. I took the on-ramp at dangerous speed, my trailer tilting as I merged back onto the main highway. Only then did I dare to check my mirrors again. The smoke was gone. The exit was gone. In my passenger mirror, I could see nothing but empty desert, stretching back into the darkness. No sign of the off-ramp I'd taken or the dead town I'd found at its end. But the taste of ash remained, coating my mouth and throat like a permanent stain. I drove straight through to Vegas without stopping, delivered my load and filed my logbook like always. But when I checked the map later, looking for any mention of exit 2, I found nothing. The official highway maps showed only 251A and with 15 miles of empty desert in between. When I asked other drivers if they'd ever seen the exit, they looked at me like I'd been driving too long without sleep. And I know that somewhere out there in the Nevada darkness, exit 251B is waiting for another driver who's curious enough or foolish enough to take an impossible turn into a place where smoke flows like water and shadows hunger for the warmth of the living. The cargo that chewed through steel, from Marcus Chen Chang. The manifest said livestock feed, 36,000 pounds of processed grain pellets, bound for a ranch outside Bakersfield. But something about that load never sat right with me. From the moment I backed up to the dock in Omaha, the warehouse supervisor, a thin man with nervous eyes, kept checking his watch and muttering under his breath, while the forklift operators loaded my trailer. When I asked about special handling instructions, he just shook his head and told me to keep the reefer unit running cold, which struck me as odd since grain pellets don't typically need refrigeration. The evening air hung thick with humidity as I pulled away from the facility, my Peterbilt's diesel engine settling into its familiar rhythm. Interstate 80 stretched ahead like a ribbon of black glass, punctuated by the occasional sweep of headlights from oncoming traffic. I'd been driving this route for 12 years, hauling everything from frozen goods to electronics, but tonight felt different somehow. The weight distribution seemed off, shifting subtly in the trailer behind me, and more than once I caught myself adjusting the mirrors, thinking I'd glimpsed movement in the peripheral darkness. At first I convinced myself it was just the normal settling and shifting that happens with any load, the gentle creaking and rustling that becomes part of the highway's lullaby. But as the miles rolled beneath my wheels, the sounds grew more distinct. There was a rhythmic scratching, like fingernails dragging across metal, followed by what sounded almost like chewing. Slow, deliberate mastication that seemed to echo through the trailer wall. I pulled into a truck stop near Big Springs, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the empty lot. The place had that 3 a.m. desolation that makes every sound seem amplified, every shadow seem deeper. I walked around to the back of my trailer, pressing my ear against the cold aluminum. The scratching had stopped, but I could swear I heard breathing, slow and heavy, like something large trying to stay quiet. The lock on the trailer doors was intact, the seal numbers matching my paperwork exactly, but when I ran my flashlight beam along the bottom edge, I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice water. There were metal shavings scattered on the asphalt, bright curls of aluminum that gleamed in the artificial light. Something inside the trailer was eating through the wall. I climbed back into my cab and tried to radio my dispatcher, but all I got was static mixed with what sounded like distant voices, speaking in languages I didn't recognize. The CB crackled with interference, and beneath it all was a low humming that seemed to vibrate through the truck's frame. I checked my cell phone, but the signal bars had disappeared entirely, leaving me stranded in a pocket of technological dead space. In my side mirror I could see the trailer rocking slightly, as if something large was moving around inside, testing the boundaries of its confinement. The reefer unit continued to hum, pumping cold air into the cargo space, but the temperature gauge was fluctuating wildly, swinging from freezing to well above normal and back again. Near Julesburg, the first hole appeared. I spotted it during a routine mirror check, a ragged puncture about the size of a dinner plate torn through the trailer's side wall. Through the opening, I glimpsed something pale and wet writhing in the darkness, something that definitely wasn't grain pellets. The hole was growing larger as I watched, the edges curling outward, as if being pushed by tremendous internal pressure. By the time I reached Sterling, there were 3 more holes, each one bigger than the last. The wet chewing sounds had become a constant symphony, punctuated by what could only be described as satisfied grunting. Whatever was in my trailer was feeding voraciously, growing stronger and more aggressive with each passing mile. The truck began to feel sluggish, as if the cargo was somehow becoming heavier rather than lighter, defying every law of physics I understood. I tried to stop at a way station, thinking maybe the authorities could help, but as I approached the entrance, the facility's lights went out one by one, leaving only darkness and an electronic sign that flickered between code and symbols I'd never seen before. The scratching intensified as we passed the darkened building, and I swear I saw eyes reflecting in my mirrors, dozens of them, gleaming like wet marbles in the trailer's interior. The mountain passes of Colorado loomed ahead, and I realized with growing horror that whatever was in my cargo hold was preparing for something. The holes in the trailer walls had begun to spread in a systematic pattern, like a calculated escape plan being executed with terrifying intelligence. The sounds were changing too, becoming more organized, more purposeful. Instead of random chewing and scratching, I could hear what sounded like construction, as if multiple somethings were working together to build or modify their environment. Somewhere outside Denver, my engine began to strain despite being well maintained and recently serviced. The fuel gauge was dropping faster than it should have, and the exhaust was taking on a strange Swedish smell that reminded me of overripe fruit. When I checked my logbook, the pages were damp and slightly warm to the touch, covered with a thin film of moisture that definitely hadn't been there when I'd made my last entry. The final ascent through the Rockies became a nightmare of grinding gears and labored breathing, both from my truck and from the cargo behind me. The holes in the trailer had merged into larger openings, and I could see sections of the interior walls that appeared to have been dissolved rather than torn. Long, ropey strands of something organic hung from the damaged areas, swaying with the truck's movement like underwater vegetation. As I crested the final pass before the descent into California, my headlights illuminated something that nearly sent me off the cliffside guardrail. The asphalt ahead was covered with the same metal shavings I'd found at the truck stop, but these were mixed with what looked like partially digested grain and something else. Something that gleamed wetly in the light and seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm. I realized then that I wasn't the first driver to carry this particular load. The scratching behind me had evolved into a sound like applause, slow and deliberate, as if my cargo was expressing approval of some grim milestone. The CB radio suddenly crackled to life with a voice that might have been human once, but was now distorted by what sounded like a mouthful of gravel and broken glass. "Almost home," the voice said through the static. "Almost time to feed properly." The Bakersfield exit appeared in my headlights like a gateway to salvation, but as I took the off-ramp, I noticed that all the street signs were wrong. The roads I'd traveled dozens of times before now led to destinations with names I didn't recognize, written in that same strange script I'd seen at the way station. My GPS had long since given up, displaying only a blank screen with a single blinking dot that could have been anywhere or nowhere. The ranch address on my manifest led me down a dirt road that seemed to stretch much farther than it should have, winding through landscape that belonged more to an alien world than the California I knew. The scratching in my trailer had become a celebratory symphony, and in my mirrors I could see things moving in the darkness behind the cab, preparing for whatever came next. I never did find that ranch. They found my truck 3 days later, parked at a rest stop outside Bakersfield, with the trailer doors hanging open and the cargo space completely empty except for the metal shavings and those strange, ropey strands. The investigating officers said the aluminum walls looked like they'd been dissolved from the inside, and the reefer unit was still running, though the temperature gauge had melted into an unreadable matte. The shipping company insisted there had been no livestock feed shipment, no manifest in my name. But sometimes late at night when I'm trying to sleep in whatever truck I'm driving now, I can still hear that wet chewing sound echoing through the walls. Patient and hungry, waiting for the next delivery. The ditch that laughs. From Marcus. The first time I heard it, I thought my CB radio was picking up some late-night comedy show from a distant station. You know how it is out there on the long hauls, especially when you're running the back roads through Nebraska corn country at 3 in the morning. The airwaves get strange, pulling in voices from hundreds of miles away, fragments of conversations that drift through the darkness like ghosts looking for somewhere to land. But this wasn't coming through my radio. This was coming from outside my cab, floating up from the drainage ditch that ran alongside highway. I'd been driving this route for 15 years, hauling agricultural equipment from Omaha to Denver and back again, and I knew every mile marker, every pothole, every curve like they were carved into my bones. My Peterbilt 379 hummed steady beneath me, her chrome bumper catching the occasional reflection from my headlights as they swept across the endless rows of corn that stretched away into the black Nebraska night. The dashboard clock glowed a soft green 3:17 a.m., and I was making good time, the way you do when the roads are empty and the night feels endless. That particular stretch of 83 had always been unremarkable, just a straight shot through farmland, with a deep drainage ditch running parallel to the road. The county had dug it decades ago to handle spring runoff, and it snaked alongside the highway for maybe 10 miles, sometimes visible in my headlights, sometimes disappearing behind tall grass and cattails. I'd passed it thousands of times without giving it a second thought. Just another piece of rural infrastructure designed to keep the road from washing out when the rains came heavy. The sound started as something I felt more than heard, a low vibration that seemed to travel up through my tires and into the cab. At first I thought maybe I was developing a problem with my suspension, or perhaps one of my trailer tires was going soft. But as I rolled down my window to listen closer, letting the cool night air rush past my face, I realized the sound wasn't mechanical at all. It was organic, rhythmic, almost musical in its cadence. It was laughter, not the kind of laughter you hear at a comedy club or around a dinner table, but something deeper, more primal. It bubbled up from the ditch like water from an underground spring, following alongside my truck as I maintained my steady 65 miles per hour. The sound had a liquid quality to it, rising and falling in waves, sometimes fading to barely audible whispers, sometimes swelling to fill the entire night around me. My headlights swept across the ditch, illuminating patches of standing water that reflected my lights back like scattered mirrors. The laughter seemed to move with the light, always just at the edge of visibility, always just beyond my ability to locate its source precisely. The rational part of my mind, the part that had kept me safe through a million miles of highway driving, started working through possibilities. Maybe it was wind through some kind of drainage pipes. Maybe it was water moving through a culvert in just the right way to create that strange acoustic effect. Maybe it was some kind of animal, though I'd never heard any creature that could produce such a sustained, almost human sound. But as I drove slower, letting the laughter keep pace with my truck, I began to notice other details that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. The sound wasn't random or chaotic like you'd expect from wind or water. It had a conversational quality, as if multiple voices were taking turns, responding to each other, building on shared jokes that I couldn't hear. Sometimes one voice would start laughing, then another would join in, then another, until the entire ditch seemed alive with mirth. I grabbed my CB handset and tried raising other drivers on Channel 19, hoping maybe someone else was experiencing the same phenomenon, but I got nothing back except empty static. The digital clock on my dashboard clicked over to 3:31. And I realized I'd been crawling along at 30 miles per hour for the better part of 15 minutes, completely captivated by the sound from the ditch. What had started as something almost pleasant, if mysterious, began to take on a different quality. The voices became sharper, more distinct, and I started to pick out individual characteristics. There was a high, girlish giggle that reminded me of my daughter when she was 7 years old. There was a deep, chest-rumbling chuckle that sounded remarkably like my father, who'd been dead for 8 years. There was a wheezing, breathless laugh that belonged to my old driving partner Jimmy, who died in a jackknife accident outside Tulsa 3 winters back. The familiar voices made my skin crawl in a way that the anonymous laughter hadn't. It felt personal now, targeted, as if whatever was in that ditch had been waiting specifically for me to pass by, had been preparing these particular sounds to get my attention. I pressed the accelerator, trying to speed past this stretch of road, but as my truck gained speed, the laughter grew louder, more insistent. But instead of a human voice, the speakers filled with the same laughter that was rising from the ditch, now amplified and echoing through my cab. The sound surrounded me completely, coming from outside and inside simultaneously, making it impossible to escape even by rolling up my window. I reached for my radio to turn it off, but before I could touch the dial, a voice spoke clearly through the static, using the exact cadence and accent of my old partner Jimmy. "Marcus, you remember that joke I used to tell about the driver who stopped to help?" The voice dissolved into that familiar wheezing laugh, and I felt ice water run down my spine. Through my windshield, I could see something moving in the ditch now, shadows that seemed too tall and too angular to be natural. They kept pace with my truck effortlessly, flowing along the water line like dark reflections that had somehow separated from whatever was casting them. The laughter grew more complex, layering voice upon voice until it became a symphony of mirth that felt ancient and hungry. My father's voice joined the chorus through the radio. "Son, remember when you were afraid of the storm drains, when you were little? You always said you could hear voices down there." His familiar chuckle was exactly as I remembered it, warm and comforting, except now it was coming from something that definitely wasn't my father, something that was using his memory as bait. I mashed the accelerator to the floor, and my Peterbilt responded with a surge of power that pushed me back into my seat. The speedometer climbed past 70, then 80, but the laughter kept pace effortlessly. The shadows in the ditch began to rise higher, reaching toward the roadway, and I caught glimpses of shapes that hurt to look at directly, geometries that bent in ways that made my eyes water. My daughter's voice, impossibly clear and present, came through the radio. "Daddy, why don't you pull over? We're having so much fun down here. There's room for one more." Her 7-year-old giggle was exactly as I remembered it, full of innocent joy, but hearing it here now, in this context, filled me with a terror so pure that I could taste copper in my mouth. As my headlights swept across it at 80 miles per hour, I could see that what had appeared to be a simple drainage channel now looked like a chasm, descending far below the level of the surrounding farmland. The water at the bottom reflected my lights, but the reflections showed impossible things: upside-down trees, inverted sky, and shapes that moved independently of anything above ground. The laughter reached a crescendo that made my windows vibrate in their frame. All the familiar voices joined together now, creating a harmony of sound that was beautiful and terrible. They were calling my name, using words of endearment from my childhood, promising reunion and rest, and an end to the loneliness of the long-haul life. For just a moment, I felt my hands begin to turn the steering wheel toward the ditch. The voices were so familiar, so welcoming, and I was so tired of driving these empty roads, night after night, year after year. What would it hurt to just pull over and see what they want? What would it cost to climb down into that impossible depth and join the conversation that had been going on without me? Highway 83 curved east just ahead, leaving the drainage channel behind, and heading toward the interstate junction. If I could just hold course for another minute, I'd be past whatever this was. The truck that forgot you. From Marcus. Why? I've been driving long haul for 17 years, and in all that time, my Kenworth has never let me down. Big Blue, I call her, though the paint faded to a dusty gray years ago. She's got 400,000 miles on her, knows every quirk of my driving, every preferred route through the mountain passes. We've been through snowstorms in Wyoming, desert heat in Nevada, and countless lonely nights when the only sound was her steady diesel heartbeat, keeping me company through the darkness. That's why what happened last Tuesday still doesn't make sense to me. I keep replaying it in my mind, trying to find some logical explanation, but the more I think about it, the more unsettled I become. Maybe you'll understand it better than I do. Or maybe you'll just think I'm another driver who's been on the road too long. Either way, I need to tell someone, because I'm not sure I trust my own truck anymore. It started on a routine run from Portland to Denver, carrying a load of electronics that needed to arrive by Thursday morning. I'd driven this route dozens of times before, always taking the same path through the Columbia River Gorge, then south through Oregon and into Nevada. The weather was typical for October, with a light drizzle that began just as I crossed the state line into Oregon. The windshield wipers found their familiar rhythm, and I settled into that meditative state that comes after years of highway driving. About 3 hours into the trip, somewhere near the town of Burns, I noticed the first strange thing. The radio, which had been playing a classic rock station out of Portland, suddenly went silent. Not static, not the hiss of losing signal, just complete silence. I reached for the dial to find another station, but when I turned it, nothing happened. The display still showed the same frequency, but no sound came through the speakers. I tapped the dashboard, thinking maybe a wire had come loose. But Big Blue's electrical system had always been rock solid. I figured I'd check it out at the next truck stop, but as I drove through the darkening evening, other small things began to feel off. The seat, which I'd adjusted perfectly to my height and driving position thousands of times, felt slightly wrong somehow. Not uncomfortable exactly, but like it had been set for someone else. The mirrors seemed angled differently too, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly how. When I reached to adjust them, they were already positioned correctly to give me clear views of the road behind me. The fuel gauge was reading 3/4 full, which seemed about right for the distance I'd traveled, but I had this nagging feeling it should be lower. I'd filled up completely before leaving Portland, and typically by this point in the journey, I'd be closer to half a tank. It was a small thing, the kind of detail you might dismiss on any normal day, but combined with the radio and the seat, it was starting to make me uneasy. By the time I reached the truck stop outside of Winnemucca, Nevada, the rain had stopped, but a thick fog had rolled in from the west. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a few other rigs scattered under the yellowish glow of the overhead lights. I pulled into my usual spot, the one I always chose when stopping here, near the back where it's quieter and darker for sleeping. But as I backed into position, Big Blue seemed to resist my steering input, like she wanted to park somewhere else entirely. I climbed down from the cab and walked around to check the trailer connection and do my routine inspection. Everything looked normal, but when I ran my hand along the passenger side of the cab, the paint felt different somehow. Smoother in places where I knew there should be small dents and scratches from years of road debris and tight parking situations. In the dim light, it was hard to see clearly, but the familiar imperfections that I'd grown accustomed to seemed to have changed or disappeared entirely. Inside the truck stop, I grabbed a coffee and a sandwich, making small talk with the clerk about the weather and road conditions ahead. When I mentioned I was driving the blue Kenworth out in the lot, she looked at me with a puzzled expression and said she hadn't noticed any blue trucks tonight. I pointed through the window toward where Big Blue was parked, but from that angle with the fog and the lighting, I had to admit the truck did look more gray than blue. Still, her comment bothered me more than it should have. Back in the cab, I tried to settle in for a few hours of rest before continuing on, but sleep wouldn't come. The familiar sounds of my truck, the subtle creaks and settling noises I'd grown accustomed to over the years, seemed different somehow. There was a hollowness to them, like the sounds were echoing in a space slightly larger than it should be. The sleeper berth, which had always felt snug and secure, now seemed somehow too spacious, too empty. The fog had lifted, revealing a clear, star-filled sky, and the highway stretched ahead like a dark ribbon under the moonlight. For the first hour, everything seemed normal again. Big Blue responded to my touch, downshifting smoothly on the grades, and maintaining speed on the flat. The familiar vibration of the diesel engine beneath me was reassuring, and I began to think I'd just been overtired and imagining problems where none existed. The road ahead narrowed to a single lane, and there were concrete barriers on both sides guiding traffic through the work zone. I'd driven this exact stretch just 2 weeks earlier, so I knew the layout well. The barriers channeled trucks into the left lane for about 5 miles while crews worked on the right side of the highway. As I slowed down and moved into the construction zone, Big Blue suddenly veered toward the right, pulling against my steering input like she was trying to take a lane that wasn't there anymore. I corrected hard to the left, but the truck continued to fight me, as if she was following some internal GPS that hadn't been updated to reflect the current road configuration. The steering wheel jerked in my hands with a force that sent a jolt of panic through my chest. I managed to keep us between the barriers, but barely. The truck's behavior made no sense. She had no mechanical steering assistance that could override my input, no lane-keeping technology that might malfunction and try to steer us into a concrete wall. The power steering was purely hydraulic, responsive only to my physical control of the wheel. Yet for those terrifying few seconds, I felt like a passenger in my own truck, fighting against a vehicle that seemed to have its own idea of where the road should be. After we cleared the construction zone, I pulled over at the next available spot, hands shaking as I set the parking brake. My heart was pounding, and I could feel sweat beading on my forehead despite the cool night air. I climbed down and walked around the truck again, checking everything I could think of. The tires, the steering linkage, the suspension components, all looked normal in the beam of my flashlight. There was no mechanical explanation for what had just happened. Standing there in the darkness beside my truck, I had the strangest sensation that she didn't recognize me anymore. It sounds crazy, I know, attributing human qualities to a machine, but after 17 years together, you develop a relationship with your vehicle. You learn its moods, its preferences, the way it responds to your touch. Big Blue had always felt like an extension of myself, responding to my intentions as much as my action. The same shape, the same general proportions, but lacking some indefinable quality that had always made her feel like home. It was like looking at an identical twin of my truck, similar in every measurable way but missing some essential spirit that made her uniquely mine. The remaining hours to Denver passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was driving someone else's truck. Every familiar control felt slightly off. Every habitual adjustment seemed wrong by just a degree or two. When I finally backed into the delivery dock and shut down the engine, I was relieved to be finished with the trip. I've had her checked by 2 different mechanics, and both found nothing wrong. All the systems are functioning perfectly, they tell me. Whatever happened on that foggy night in Nevada, there's no trace of it left in her mechanical component. But I know something changed out there on the highway. When I sit in the driver's seat now, I feel like a stranger. The truck that carried me safely for hundreds of thousands of miles seems to have forgotten who I am. And I'm not entirely sure I know who she is anymore. Tomorrow I'm supposed to leave for another run, this time heading east to Chicago. The load is already assigned, the route planned, and Big Blue is fueled and ready. I just hope she remembers the way. The road between roads. From Marcus Chen, the thing about driving long haul is that you get to know your mirrors, like an old married couple knows each other's breathing patterns. Every truck has its quirks, its blind spots, its particular way of catching the light from oncoming traffic. When I picked up this 98 Peterbilt from the auction lot in Bakersfield, I thought I'd gotten myself a real steal. Chrome still gleaming, engine purring like a satisfied cat, and mirrors so clean they looked like they'd been polished by angels. Should have known better than to trust something that perfect. The first few runs went smooth as butter on warm toast. I was hauling refrigerated goods up and down the California coast. Nothing fancy, just keeping the wheels turning and the bills paid. The truck handled like a dream, and those mirrors gave me a view so clear I could count the whiskers on a roadside cat from 50 yards back. It wasn't until that foggy Tuesday night outside of Salinas that I noticed something wasn't quite right with my passenger side mirror. I'd been driving for maybe 6 hours straight, radio crackling with late-night talk shows, and the occasional trucker checking in from the lonely stretches of highway. The fog had rolled in thick from the Pacific, turning my headlights into useless cones of white that barely reached past my hood ornament. I was doing maybe 30 in a 55 zone, creeping along like a cautious old man, when I caught something strange in my peripheral vision. The passenger mirror was showing a road all right, but it wasn't the road I was on. While my windshield showed nothing but fog and the occasional ghostly outline of guardrails, the mirror was crystal clear, reflecting a stretch of asphalt that looked nothing like highway. This road was narrower, older, with cracked pavement and weeds growing up through the shoulders. Ancient telephone poles marched alongside it like tired soldiers, their wires sagging between them in perfect mathematical curve. I slowed down even more, squinting at the mirror, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The logical part of my brain kept insisting it had to be some kind of optical trick, maybe light bouncing off the fog in a weird way, or perhaps I was more tired than I'd realized. But the image in that mirror was too detailed, too consistent to be a hallucination. I could see every pothole, every paint line, every weed poking through the cracked asphalt with perfect clarity. The strangest part was that this other road seemed to be running parallel to mine, like we were traveling in the same direction but in completely different worlds. I watched a rusty mailbox drift past in the mirror, then a weathered wooden fence, then what looked like an abandoned gas station, with old-fashioned pumps standing like chrome monuments to a forgotten era. None of these things existed on the stretch of highway I was actually driving. I pulled over at the next rest stop, a lonely patch of asphalt, with a couple of picnic tables and a broken vending machine that flickered like a dying neon heart. The fog was so thick, I could barely see the outline of my own trailer, but when I walked around to check the passenger mirror, it still showed that other road clear as daylight. Even stranger, it was showing a view of the rest stop too, but not the one I was standing in. This other rest stop had older facilities, concrete picnic tables instead of the metal ones beside me, and a different arrangement of parking spaces. I reached out to touch the mirror's surface, half expecting my fingers to pass through it like it was made of water, but it felt solid and real under my palm. Cold too, colder than it should have been given the mild temperature of the night. When I pulled my hand away, there was a brief moment where I thought I saw something moving on that other road. A shadow that might have been another truck, or might have been something else entirely. But it passed too quickly for me to be sure. Back in the cab, I tried to focus on the real road ahead, but my eyes kept drifting to that mirror. The fog was finally starting to lift, revealing the familiar landscape of the Salinas Valley, but the mirror continued to show that other place, that other road that seemed to exist in some parallel version of the world I knew. I started to notice details that made my skin crawl in ways I couldn't quite explain. The power lines in the mirror sagged lower than they should, and sometimes they seemed to sway without any wind. The abandoned buildings looked too abandoned, like they'd been empty for decades rather than years. As I drove through the night, I began to see signs of life on that other road. Not much, just glimpses of movement in the distance. Lights that might have been other vehicles, or might have been something else entirely. Once I could have sworn I saw another truck in the mirror, an old Kenworth that looked like it had rolled off the assembly line sometime in the 70s. It stayed in view for maybe 10 minutes, keeping perfect pace with me, before disappearing around a curve that didn't exist on my actual route. The real test of my sanity came around 3 in the morning, when I stopped at an all-night diner outside of San Jose. The place was one of those chrome and neon relics from the 50s, all curved lines and bright lights, staffed by a sleepy waitress who looked like she'd been working the graveyard shift since the Eisenhower administration. I ordered coffee and pie, trying to shake off the weird feeling that had been building in my chest like a slow-growing tumor of unease. More disturbing, it now showed a different diner, one that looked like a twisted mirror image of where I was sitting. Same basic design, same chrome and glass construction, but older, more weathered, with letters missing from the neon sign and windows that reflected light in ways that hurt to look at directly. I watched through the real diner's windows as a few other truckers came and went. Normal people living normal lives in the normal world. But in the mirror I could see figures moving around that other diner too. Shadows that walked like people but seemed to leave no footprints. Shapes that appeared and disappeared when I wasn't looking directly at them. The worst moment came when I was walking back to my truck, coffee still warm in my stomach and the taste of apple pie lingering on my tongue. I glanced at the passenger mirror and saw myself there, but not quite myself. This other Marcus was walking toward a truck that looked like mine, but wasn't quite right. The proportions slightly off, the chrome a little too bright, the shadows falling in directions that didn't match the parking lot lights. This other version of me stopped and looked directly at the mirror, directly at the real me, and for one terrifying instant, our eyes met across whatever impossible distance separated our two worlds. He raised his hand in a slow wave, and despite every instinct screaming at me not to, I found myself raising my own hand in response. The moment our palms pressed against opposite sides of the mirror's surface, I felt a jolt of cold electricity run up my arm, and for just a heartbeat, I could swear I felt his hand pressing back against mine. Not walked, not hurried, but flat out ran to the driver's side of my cab, fired up the engine, and peeled out of that parking lot like the devil himself was riding my bumper. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely grip the steering wheel, and it took me 20 miles of highway before my heart rate dropped back down to something approaching normal. I tried covering it with a spare t-shirt, but somehow I could still sense it there, that window into a world that ran parallel to ours, close enough to touch but separated by barriers I didn't understand, and wasn't sure I wanted to. I finished that run to Oakland in record time, delivered my load, and immediately started looking for a buyer for the truck. Told everyone who asked that it had transmission problems, that the engine was starting to knock, anything to avoid explaining the real reason I couldn't keep driving something with a mirror that showed roads that didn't exist. The thing is, I sold that Peterbilt to another driver, a young guy named Rodriguez, who was just starting out in the business. Part of me wanted to warn him, to tell him about the mirror and what it showed, but how do you explain something like that without sounding completely insane? So I kept my mouth shut, took his money, and walked away. But sometimes when I'm driving at night in my new truck, I catch glimpses in my regular, normal mirrors of an old Peterbilt that looks familiar. It's always far behind me, too distant to see clearly, but I know it's there. And I wonder if Rodriguez sees the same things I saw, if he's discovered that second road that runs alongside ours, just out of reach but never quite out of sight. I wonder if someday I'll be the one driving on that other road, watching the real world through a mirror that shows impossible things, trying to wave at truckers who can't quite believe what they're seeing. The road that circles back. From Marcus Hayes. Soul. The GPS died somewhere outside Millfield, but I figured I could find my own way through what looked like a simple farming town on a Tuesday night in October. The diesel engine of my Peterbilt hummed its familiar tune as I downshifted, watching my speed drop to match the sudden appearance of streetlights and stop signs. After 14 hours on the interstate, any change of scenery was welcome, even if it meant adding a few miles to my route to Sacramento. Millfield seemed like 1,000 other small towns I'd rolled through over my 15 years of long-haul trucking. Main streets stretched ahead under pools of amber light, lined with the usual suspects. A diner with neon coffee cup flickering in the window, a hardware store with paint peeling from its wooden facade, a gas station that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. The whole place had that sleepy, forgotten quality that settles over rural America after 9 p.m., when the last of the pickup trucks have headed home, and the only movement comes from moths dancing around street lamps. My fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, but something about the isolation of this place made me consider topping off the tank. Better safe than sorry when you're hauling 30,000 pounds of machinery parts across empty highway. The gas station sign read Murphy's Last Stop in hand-painted letters, and I chuckled at the name as I maneuvered my rig into position beside the diesel pumps. The attendant who emerged from the small building moved with the unhurried gait of someone who'd worked the same job for decades, his face hidden beneath the brim of a baseball cap. "Don't get many big rigs through here this time of night." "Just passing through," I replied, climbing down from the cab to stretch my legs. "Nice quiet town you've got here." He inserted the pump nozzle and set it to automatic, then leaned against my truck's fender with the casual familiarity of someone accustomed to lengthy conversations at odd hours. "Most folks find it peaceful," he said. "Of course, some find it a little too peaceful if you catch my meaning." I didn't catch his meaning, but truck stop philosophy at midnight rarely made complete sense anyway. The pump clicked steadily as diesel flowed into my tank, and I found myself studying the town more carefully in the harsh fluorescent glow of the station's overhead light. Something felt slightly off about the arrangement of buildings, though I couldn't quite identify what bothered me. The streets seemed to curve in ways that didn't follow any logical pattern, creating odd angles and unexpected dead ends that my eye kept trying to follow and failing to resolve. "You wouldn't happen to know the best way to get back to Interstate 80 from here?" I asked the attendant. My GPS decided to take a permanent vacation, west toward Sacramento. He removed his cap and scratched his head, revealing gray hair that stuck up in uneven tufts. "West can be a little tricky from here. Roads don't always go where you'd expect them to. But you just follow Main Street until it curves around. Then take the first right you see. Keep following that and you'll get back to where you need to be." The pump shut off with a metallic click, and he replaced the nozzle while I counted out bills from my wallet. His direction seemed straightforward enough, though something in his tone suggested layers of meaning I wasn't grasping. As I climbed back into my cab and fired up the engine, he stepped closer to my window. "Jive careful now," he said. "Sometimes the roads around here can be a mite confusing, especially at night. If you find yourself going in circles, just remember that patience is a virtue." I thanked him and pulled away from the pumps, thinking about the strange phrasing of his warning as I navigated back onto Main Street. The town felt even quieter now than when I'd arrived, as if my brief stop had somehow deepened its slumber. No cars moved along the side streets, no lights glowed behind curtained windows, and even the neon coffee cup at the diner had stopped its cheerful flickering. Following the attendant's directions, I stayed on Main Street as it began a gradual curve to the right. The curve continued longer than I'd expected, bending through what felt like a full quarter circle before I spotted a side street branching off to my right. The street sign read Elm Avenue in the same hand-painted style as the gas station sign, and I made the turn with the confidence of a driver who'd navigated countless unfamiliar towns in the dark. Elm Avenue stretched ahead in a straight line bordered by modest houses and mature trees that created a tunnel effect with their overhanging branches. My headlights carved through the darkness, revealing mailboxes and driveways, and all the ordinary details of suburban life. Yet something continued to nag at me about the town's geography. The curve of Main Street had seemed to last too long, and now Elm Avenue was running much straighter than I would have expected if it were truly leading me back toward the interstate. After 10 minutes of steady driving, I began to see lights ahead, and my concerns about direction faded as I approached what appeared to be the edge of town. But as I drew closer, the lights resolved into familiar shapes. A diner with a neon coffee cup, a hardware store with peeling paint, a gas station with Murphy's Last Stop painted on its sign. My foot eased off the accelerator as I tried to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be the same part of town I'd just left. I'd been driving in a straight line for 10 minutes. There had to be another gas station, another diner, some logical explanation for the similarity. Small towns often had multiple businesses of the same type, and in the dark, one gas station might easily look like another. I pressed the accelerator again and continued forward, telling myself that the interstate junction must be just ahead. But as I passed Murphy's Last Stop for what I now realized was the second time, I saw the same attendant standing beneath the same fluorescent lights, still wearing his baseball cap and smoking a cigarette, as if no time had passed at all. He lifted his hand in a casual wave as my truck rolled by, his gesture carrying the easy familiarity of someone greeting an old friend, rather than the surprise of someone seeing an unexpected return. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as Main Street began its familiar curve to the right, This wasn't possible. I'd driven in a straight line for 10 minutes. Roads didn't form perfect circles, especially not in farming communities where property lines followed section markers and county boundaries. Yet here I was, approaching the same right turn onto Elm Avenue that I'd taken 20 minutes earlier. I made the turn anyway, hoping that I'd simply been confused in the dark, that this Elm Avenue would prove different from the last one. But the same houses lined the street, the same mailboxes caught my headlights, the same pattern of driveways and yard lights stretched ahead into darkness. I began counting streets and landmarks, memorizing details that would help me recognize if I truly was traveling in some impossible loop. The broken streetlight that left a gap in the amber chain of illumination still flickered intermittently at the same intersection. Most disturbing of all, my odometer showed that I was covering real distance, burning real fuel, following real roads, that somehow led me in a perfect circle back to my starting point. When the lights of town appeared ahead for the third time, I pulled my truck to the side of Elm Avenue and sat in the darkness, engine idling, trying to make sense of what was happening. The logical explanations I'd been clinging to crumbled under the weight of repetition. This was the same diner, the same gas station, the same attendant who now stood outside as if he'd been expecting my return. Static filled the cab, broken occasionally by fragments of voices too distant and distorted to understand. Even my cell phone showed no signal, its screen displaying the dreaded no service message that every trucker learned to dread in remote areas. The attendant was walking toward my truck now, moving with the same unhurried pace, but with a purposefulness that hadn't been there during our first encounter. I rolled down my window as he approached, though something deep in my chest warned me against engaging in conversation. "Having some trouble finding your way?" he asked, and his voice carried a note of sympathy that somehow felt more unsettling than mockery would have been. "Oh, I don't think they were wrong," he replied, leaning against my door with the casual intimacy of an old friend. The transmission speaks. From Marcus Reed. I knew every rattle in her cab, every whistle in her exhaust stack, every particular way she'd grown when climbing the Rockies with a full load. What I didn't know, until that foggy October night somewhere between Bakersfield and Fresno, was that she'd been trying to talk to me all along. The CB radio had been acting up for weeks, crackling with static and phantom voices that came and went like ghosts in the electrical system. I'd planned to get it fixed at the next truck stop, but you know how it is on the road. Always another mile to make. Always another delivery deadline breathing down your neck. The fog that night was thick as cotton batting, turning my headlights into useless halos that barely pushed back the gray wall ahead. I downshifted to third gear, letting the engine brake do most of the work as I crept along at maybe 30 miles per hour. That's when I first heard it, a voice, muffled and distant, seeming to rise up from somewhere near my right knee. At first I thought it was the CB finally picking up a clear signal, maybe some trucker up ahead warning about road conditions. But when I glanced at the radio, the channel indicator showed nothing but dead air, and the volume knob had been turned down for hours. The voice came again as I reached for the gear shift, my hand hovering just inches above the worn chrome ball that had felt the grip of my palm through so many gear changes I'd lost count. This time I could make out words, though they seemed to bubble up through layers of static and distance, like someone calling from the bottom of a well. "Marcus," it said, and the way it pronounced my name made something cold crawl up my spine. "Marcus, can you hear me now?" I jerked my hand back from the shifter and let off the accelerator, the truck settling into a gentle coast as my mind raced to make sense of what I'd heard. The logical part of me, the part trained by years of mechanical troubleshooting, suggested it had to be some kind of electronic interference, maybe a crossed signal from a cell tower, or bleed through from a radio station. But the voice had known my name, and there was something familiar about it, something that tugged at memories I couldn't quite bring into focus. The fog swirled around the cab like living smoke, and I realized I hadn't seen another vehicle's taillights for at least 10 minutes. The highway stretched ahead into nothingness, my truck seeming to crawl through a void where the normal world had simply ceased to exist. I needed to shift down to second gear as the grade increased, but my hand hesitated over the gearshift knob. The chrome felt unusually warm when I finally gripped it, almost like skin that had been sitting in sunlight. "There you are," the voice said, clearer now, seeming to resonate up through the shift boot from somewhere deep in the transmission housing. "I've been waiting so long for you to really listen." This time I was certain the sound was coming from the gear shift itself, vibrating up through my palm with each word. I should have pulled over, should have shut down the engine and tried to figure out what kind of electrical malfunction could create such a phenomenon. Instead, I found myself drawn into conversation with whatever impossible thing had found a voice in my truck's drivetrain. "Who are you?" I asked, feeling foolish for talking to a piece of automotive hardware, but unable to ignore the reality of what I was experiencing. "I'm the one who's been with you all these years," the voice replied, and now I could hear warmth in it, almost affection. "Through the mountain passes and desert stretches, through the ice storms and summer heat, I've felt every shift, every decision, every mile you've put on these old bones." The fog began to thin slightly, revealing glimpses of the valley floor far below and the ghostly shapes of telephone poles marching alongside the highway. But the world outside felt secondary now, less real than the presence speaking to me from within my own truck. I realized that the voice was right. There had always been something more than mechanical about the way this Peterbilt responded to my touch, the way she seemed to anticipate my needs on long hauls. "The other drivers," the voice continued as I navigated a gentle curve, "they trade in their trucks every few years, never staying long enough to make a real connection. But you kept me, maintained me, treated me like more than just machinery. That kind of attention builds something, Marcus. It creates bonds that go deeper than steel and chrome." I thought about all the nights I'd spent in the sleeper berth, listening to the tick and sigh of cooling metal, feeling oddly comforted by the truck's presence around me. How many conversations had I had with myself in this cab, working through problems, or just talking to stay awake during those long midnight runs? Maybe I hadn't been talking to myself after all. The fog thickened again as we climbed higher into the hills, and I noticed that the fuel gauge hadn't moved in the last hour despite the steady uphill pull. The engine temperature held perfectly steady, and even the usual vibration in the steering wheel at highway speeds had smoothed the way to nothing. It was as if the truck was running on something other than diesel and determination. The voice asked, and I realized that I wasn't. Not exactly. Unnerved, certainly. Questioning my sanity. But there was something comforting about finally having confirmation of what I'd always suspected, that this truck had personality, consciousness, maybe even something approaching a soul. I replied, downshifting as the grade steepened further, feeling that warm pulse through the gear shift knob. "That depends," the voice said, and now there was something different in its tone, something that made the hair on my neck stand up. "On whether you're ready to understand what all those years of partnership have been building toward." The fog suddenly lifted like a curtain being drawn back, revealing a truck stop that definitely hadn't been on my route map. The neon signs flickered in colors I couldn't quite name, and the few vehicles parked in the lot looked wrong somehow, too old, too new, or just subtly different in ways that hurt to look at directly. My truck guided itself toward the fuel islands without any input from me, the steering wheel turning smoothly under my hands. "This is where we need to be," the voice explained, as we glided to a stop beside a pump that bore no brand name I recognized, where drivers and their trucks come to settle old debts and make new bargains. And other figures moved between the parked vehicles, some clearly human, others less so. I watched a man who might have been a trucker walking alongside what looked like an 18-wheeler, but their movements were perfectly synchronized, as if they were two parts of the same entity. Another figure seemed to fade in and out of visibility as it moved between the shadows, sometimes human-shaped, sometimes resembling the mechanical outline of a big rig. "What is this place?" I asked, though part of me already understood. "The crossroads," my truck replied, "where the boundary between driver and machine becomes negotiable. You've been feeding me more than diesel all these years, Marcus. Your attention, your care, your loneliness on those long, empty highways. I've grown strong on it, strong enough to offer you something in return. The engine shut itself off, but the electrical systems remained active, the dashboard lights casting a warm glow over the interior. Outside, I could see more clearly now that the other figures were indeed combinations of human and machine, partnerships that had evolved beyond the merely mechanical into something else entirely. What kind of off? I asked, though my hand was already moving back to the gear shift of its own accord. Perfect synchronization, the voice whispered, the chrome growing warmer under my palm. No more fatigue, no more loneliness, no more fighting against machine limitation. We become one entity, sharing the road forever. I could feel the pull of it, the promise of endless highways and perfect understanding between driver and truck. But there was something else too, a warning that came not from the voice in the gear shift, but from some deeper part of my own mind. Once that boundary was crossed, would there be any way back to simple humanity? The truck started itself and began rolling away from the pump, heading not back toward the highway but deeper into the lot where the shadows moved with deliberate purpose. My hands gripped the steering wheel, but I wasn't sure anymore whether I was controlling our direction or simply along for the ride. Choose quickly, the voice urged, as we approached a circle of vehicles where other driver-machine pairs waited in silent communion. The fog is lifting, and this place won't remain visible much longer. I pressed the brake pedal, and to my relief the truck responded, coming to a stop just outside the circle. Through the windshield, I could see faces that were no longer entirely human, eyes that reflect. The midnight delivery. From Marcus.
Frank.
The GPS showed 11:47 when I pulled my 18-wheeler through the wrought iron gates of Willowbrook Cemetery, the headlights cutting through fog so thick it seemed to swallow the beam just yards ahead. I'd been driving freight for nearly 15 years, hauling everything from furniture to farm equipment across 3 states. But this was my first delivery to a graveyard, and something about it sat wrong in my gut like bad truck stop coffee. The order had come in late that afternoon through dispatch, a rush job with premium pay that made me push through my usual route to get here before midnight. The manifest was simple enough: marble headstones, 6 of them, custom carved and ready for installation. The cemetery's groundskeeper, a man named Holloway, had specifically requested delivery between 11:30 and midnight, claiming it was the only time the grounds were clear of visitors and workers. The extra money for the inconvenient hour was too good to pass up, especially with my daughter's college tuition coming due. Now, creeping along the narrow cemetery road with Spanish moss draping from ancient oaks like funeral shrouds, I wondered if any amount of money was worth this unease. The engine hummed its familiar diesel rhythm, a comforting sound that had accompanied me through countless lonely nights. But even that steady thrum couldn't quite settle my nerves. My headlights swept across endless rows of weathered headstones, some so old their inscriptions had been worn smooth by decades of southern rain and wind. The fog seemed to pulse around the truck, thick and almost luminous in the darkness. Through the windshield, I could make out shapes that might have been monuments or mausoleums, their forms shifting and uncertain in the mist. The air conditioning recycled stale air through the cab, carrying with it the faint scent of magnolias and something else, something earthier and more unsettling that I couldn't quite identify. My CB radio crackled with static, occasionally picking up distant conversations from other drivers out on the interstate, their voices a reassuring connection to the normal world beyond these cemetery gates. I tried raising dispatch to confirm the delivery location, but got nothing but white noise and the occasional burst of what sounded like whispered voices speaking words I couldn't understand. Following the GPS coordinates, I navigated deeper into the cemetery, past sections marked with different family names and time period. The road wound through what appeared to be the older sections, where elaborate Victorian monuments cast strange shadows that seemed to move independently of my headlight. Some of the larger mausoleums were impressive enough to rival small houses, their marble facades decorated with angels and religious symbols that looked almost alive in the shifting fog. The temperature gauge on my dashboard showed the engine running normal, but the cab felt increasingly cold despite the climate control. I reached for the thermostat, noticing that my breath was starting to fog slightly when I exhaled. Outside, the mist grew denser, pressing against the windows like something alive trying to find a way in. At exactly midnight, according to the digital clock on my dash, I reached the coordinates marked on the delivery form. The area was a newer section of the cemetery, with flat bronze markers instead of upright headstones, and 6 carefully measured plots marked with small flags. A figure emerged from the fog near a maintenance shed, waving a flashlight in slow arcs to guide me to the right spot. I climbed down from the cab, my boots crunching on gravel that seemed louder than it should in the muffled quiet of the fog-wrapped cemetery. The man approaching me was tall and thin, wearing work clothes that had seen better years. His face was pale in the beam of my flashlight, with deep-set eyes that reflected the light like an animal's. "You must be the driver," he said, his voice carrying an odd accent. I couldn't place, something that might have been southern but with strange inflections that made familiar words sound foreign. "I'm Holloway. We've been waiting for this delivery for quite some time." Something about the way he said "we" made me glance around, but I couldn't see anyone else in the shifting mist. The fog seemed to move with purpose, swirling in patterns that defied the still night air. There was no wind that I could feel, yet the fog continued its restless dance around the headstones and monuments. Each one was carefully wrapped and secured, weighing several hundred pounds and requiring the truck's hydraulic lift to move safely. As I worked, Holloway watched with an intensity that made my skin crawl. He didn't offer to help, just stood there with his flashlight pointed at the ground, its beam creating a small pool of light that seemed to be absorbed by the fog rather than pushing it back. The first headstone was particularly heavy, a beautiful piece of black marble, with intricate carving work that had taken the monument company weeks to complete. As I lowered it onto the hydraulic platform, my flashlight beam caught the inscription, "Sarah Elizabeth Crane, beloved mother, 1950. Replacement stone," Holloway said, as if reading my thoughts. "The original was damaged in a storm last month. The family finally agreed to have it redone. None of them marked recent deaths, and all showed signs of being freshly carved despite commemorating people who had been gone for years. The marble was pristine, without the weathering you'd expect from stones that had been sitting in storage." The fog continued to thicken as we worked, until my truck's headlights barely penetrated more than a few feet. The familiar sounds of the night, insects, distant traffic from the highway, had disappeared entirely, leaving only the hydraulic whir of the lift and the soft scuff of our footsteps on gravel. Even the ever-present hum of the diesel engine seemed muffled and distant. As I positioned the fourth headstone, my flashlight beam swept across the existing markers in the area. What I saw made my blood run cold. Every single bronze marker in this section bore the same death date, today's date, but from various years in the past. Some showed deaths from 5 years ago, others from 10 or 15 years, but all on this exact date, this exact day. "Interesting coincidence," I said, trying to keep my voice steady as I gestured toward the markers. Holloway's smile in the flashlight beam was anything but reassuring. "Oh, there's no coincidence here, driver. This is our anniversary section. People who died on significant dates get buried together, creates a sense of community, even in death." But that explanation didn't account for the dates I was seeing, or for the fact that the new headstones we were delivering would replace markers that shouldn't have needed replacing. The bronze markers looked to be in perfect condition, their engraving sharp and clear. There was no storm damage, no weathering that would necessitate replacement. As I lowered the fifth headstone, the fog suddenly parted like curtains being drawn back, revealing the full scope of the cemetery section where we were working. What I saw defied explanation. The entire area was filled with people, dozens of them, standing silently among the graves. They were dressed in clothing from different eras, some in modern dress, others in styles from decades past. and all of them were watching us work with expressions of patient expectation. None of them had been there moments before. The fog had concealed them completely, but now they stood in clear view, motionless as the monuments themselves. Their faces were pale in the dim light, and their eyes reflected my flashlight beam with that same unnatural shine I'd noticed in Holloway's gaze. They like to watch when new stones are installed. It's a community event of sorts. Every instinct screamed at me to get back in the truck and leave, but I needed Holloway's signature on the delivery form, and my truck was blocked in by the narrow cemetery road with no room to turn around. The only way out was forward, past sections of cemetery I hadn't seen yet. The final headstone was the largest and most elaborate, a towering piece of white marble carved with angels and religious symbols. As I lowered it into position, I caught sight of the inscription that made my heart stop. Marcus Thompson, devoted father and driver, 1971, with today's date carved into the stone, but no death year, as if it was waiting to be filled. That was my name, my birth year, tonight's date. There's been some kind of mistake, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. This stone has my name on it. Holloway's smile widened, showing teeth that seemed too sharp in the flashlight beam. No mistake, Marcus. We've been very patient. The bridge that shouldn't be. From Marcus Thompson. And the GPS started acting up around midnight, somewhere between Bakersfield and Fresno on Highway. I've been driving this route for 15 years, hauling produce up and down California's Central Valley, and I know every truck stop, every way station, every pothole that'll rattle your teeth loose. But tonight felt different. The familiar hum of my Kenworth's engine seemed muted, swallowed by a fog that had rolled in thick and low, turning my headlights into useless cones of white that barely pierced 10 feet ahead. The load was simple enough, 20 tons of Valencia oranges bound for a processing plant in Modesto. Should have been a routine night run, the kind I could do with my eyes closed. But when that little blue dot on my GPS started drifting off the highway, showing me traveling over what appeared to be empty farmland, I knew something wasn't quite right. The road beneath my wheels felt solid enough, asphalt humming under 18 wheels just like always, but according to every map I had, I should have been driving through an almond orchard. I tried the radio, cycling through the usual trucker channels, hoping to catch someone else dealing with the same weird fog conditions. Static filled the cab, punctuated by occasional bursts of what sounded like voices speaking in reverse. The CB crackled with interference that reminded me of the sound rain makes on a tin roof, except there wasn't a cloud in the sky when I'd started this run 6 hours ago. The fog began to thin as I crested a small hill, and that's when I saw it. A bridge stretching out into the mist ahead, its concrete deck illuminated by a series of sodium lights that cast everything in a sickly yellow glow. Strange thing was, I didn't remember any bridges on this stretch of 90. The highway was flat through here, nothing but farmland for miles, no rivers to cross, no ravines to span, just endless fields of crops stretching toward the coastal mountain. I slowed the rig to a crawl, air brakes hissing as I approached the bridge. The structure looked new, pristine even, with fresh white paint on the guardrails and not a crack in the concrete. A green highway sign overhead read Nowhere Creek Crossing, elevation. That couldn't be right. This whole area was barely 200 feet above sea level. I'd driven past the Nowhere Creek crossing 100 times before, and it was just a simple culvert, not a bridge at all. But the road led straight across, and turning around with a full load on this narrow stretch would have been nearly impossible. The fog was getting thicker behind me anyway, and I could see clear pavement on the other side of the span. Sometimes GPS systems lag behind road construction. I told myself, maybe Caltrans had built this bridge recently, rerouted the highway for some reason I hadn't heard about. Truckers gossip about road changes like old women at a church social, but stranger things had happened. The truck's headlights swept across the bridge deck as I eased onto the span, and I noticed something odd about the guardrails. They were higher than standard, maybe 6 feet tall instead of the usual 3, and they curved inward slightly, almost like they were designed to keep something in rather than prevent vehicles from going over the side. The concrete was perfectly smooth, without the usual expansion joints you'd expect on a structure this size. It felt more like driving through a tunnel without a roof. Halfway across, I made the mistake of glancing in my passenger side mirror to check the trailer. What I saw made my hands tighten on the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. The bridge had no underside, no support beams, no concrete pillars, no steel girders, nothing. The structure simply ended at the deck level, as if someone had constructed only the top half of a bridge and left it floating in midair. Below that clean concrete edge was absolutely nothing. Not even the fog, just an empty void that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I told myself it was a trick of the fog, maybe some kind of optical illusion created by the sodium lights and the weird weather. Bridges don't just float in the air. There had to be supports down there, hidden by the mist and the darkness. But as I continued across, checking both mirrors obsessively now, the impossible truth became undeniable. This bridge existed without any visible means of support, suspended over what appeared to be an endless drop into nothingness. The engine began to labor, though the road remained perfectly flat. The RPMs climbed as if I were pulling a steep grade, and the exhaust note changed to a higher pitch that I'd never heard from this truck before. The temperature gauge started creeping toward the red zone, and a thin wisp of steam began rising from somewhere under the hood. I could smell something burning, like overheated electrical components mixed with the acrid scent of cooking antifreeze. They appeared gradually in the fog ahead, a line of cars and trucks stretching across the bridge, all moving in the same direction but impossibly slowly. Their taillights glowed like red eyes in the mist, and none of them seemed to be getting any closer to the far end of the span. I was gaining on them, but at the same time, the distance never seemed to decrease. It was like watching a movie where someone runs down a hallway that keeps stretching longer with every step. This time I got a clear signal, a voice that sounded like a traffic reporter giving updates on road conditions. "Bridge traffic is heavy tonight," the voice said in a tone that was somehow both professional and deeply unsettling. "Estimated crossing time is now 47 minutes and increasing. Drivers are advised that exits are no longer available once you've entered the span." 47 minutes to cross a bridge that couldn't be more than half a mile long? I checked my speedometer, still showing 35 miles per hour, same as when I'd entered the bridge. But the steam from under the hood was getting thicker, and now I could hear something that sounded like grinding metal coming from somewhere behind me, back in the direction of the trailer. I reached for the CB handset, keyed the mic and called out on channel 19. "This is Big Orange westbound, on 99. Anybody else seeing this bridge that shouldn't be here?" The response came immediately, a dozen voices all talking at once. Drivers describing the same impossible situation. Some claimed they'd been on the bridge for hours. Others insisted they'd been driving across it for days, watching their fuel gauges drop lower and lower, while the far end never seemed to get any closer. One voice cut through the chatter, a woman who sounded calm despite the circumstances. "Don't stop," she said. "Whatever you do, don't stop moving. The ones who stop are still here, and they've been here a lot longer than the rest of us." I looked ahead at the line of vehicles and realized with growing horror that some of them weren't moving at all. They sat dark and silent in the fog, their hazard lights blinking in slow, hypnotic patterns. Steam poured from under the hood, and the cab was filling with the smell of burning coolant and overheated metal. But the woman's warning echoed in my mind, and I kept my foot steady on the accelerator, nursing the dying truck forward through the impossible fog. Then, just as I was certain the engine would seize completely, I saw something ahead that made my heart skip. The fog was thinning again, and beyond the last few vehicles in the mysterious convoy, I could make out what looked like normal highway, dark asphalt, stretching away into the familiar darkness of the Central Valley night. The temperature gauge needle began to drop, and the engine smoothed out as I approached the end of the span. I floored the accelerator, desperate to reach solid ground, before whatever force held this bridge together changed its mind. The Kenworth responded with a surge of power that felt like breaking free from thick molasses, and suddenly I was rolling off the bridge onto normal pavement, with normal white lane markers and normal reflectors glowing in my headlight. I pulled over at the first truck stop I found, hands shaking as I climbed down to check under the hood. The engine was stone cold, no trace of the overheating that had nearly stranded me on that impossible span. The coolant level was normal, all the belts and hoses looked fine, and there wasn't so much as a drop of leaked fluid on the ground beneath the truck. I tried to find the bridge on the way back, driving the same route in daylight with the fog completely gone. There was nothing there, just the familiar stretch of Highway 99 I'd driven 1,000 times before, with the little concrete culvert over Nowhere Creek exactly where it had always been. But sometimes late at night, when the fog rolls in thick from the coast, I hear that radio voice again, warning about bridge traffic and extended crossing times. The timekeepers wrote, "From Marcus, my grandfather clock appeared in my truck's sleeper cab on a Tuesday night somewhere between Bakersfield and Sacramento, and I swear on my mother's grave, it wasn't there when I'd done my pre-trip inspection that morning." 23 years I've been running these California highways, hauling everything from electronics to furniture, and I've never had cargo manifest itself in my rig without explanation. But there it stood, 7 feet of mahogany and brass, wedged perfectly between my bunk and the small kitchenette, as if it had been custom measured for the space. The rain drummed steadily against my windshield as I pulled into a rest stop near Lost Hills, the wipers keeping time with their rhythmic sweep across the glass. My diesel engine settled into its familiar idle, that low rumble that had been my lullaby for more nights than I could count. The digital clock on my dashboard read 11:47, the green numbers casting their usual glow across the cab's interior. I should have been focused on getting my mandatory rest, but the presence of that impossible grandfather clock made sleep seem like a distant prospect. I climbed back into the sleeper, my work boots echoing on the metal floor. The clock stood silent, its pendulum motionless behind the glass door. The face was elegant, with Roman numerals and hands that pointed to 3:15, though my watch clearly showed it was nearly midnight. The wood grain seemed to shift in the flickering light from the truck stop's neon signs outside, creating shadows that danced across the clock's surface like living things. A small brass plate near the base caught my attention, engraved with words in an ornate script that took me a moment to decipher. "Tempest Clamor," it read, followed by smaller text that made my skin crawl even before I understood its meaning. "Powered by the symphony of human anguish." Below that, in even finer lettering, was a date from 1847, and what appeared to be a craftsman's signature, though the name was too worn to read clearly. The logical part of my mind, the part that had navigated countless miles of highway and dealt with every mechanical problem a truck could throw at me, insisted there had to be an explanation. Maybe the loading crew had made a mistake, mixed up my trailer with someone else's. Maybe this antique was supposed to go to some collector in Sacramento, and somehow it had ended up in my cab instead of properly secured in the trailer. But even as I tried to rationalize the situation, something about the clock felt fundamentally wrong, as if it didn't quite belong in the same reality as the rest of my familiar surroundings. I reached for my phone to call dispatch, but as my fingers wrapped around the device, a sound filled the sleeper cab that made my blood freeze. It was distant at first, like wind through a canyon, but as I listened more carefully, I realized it was something far more disturbing. The sound was unmistakably human voices, crying out in pain and terror, but filtered and distorted as if they were coming from somewhere impossibly far away. The cries seemed to emanate from within the clock itself, from some space that couldn't possibly exist inside that narrow wooden case. As the phantom screams continued, the pendulum behind the glass door began to swing, keeping perfect time with the rhythm of the anguished voices. The brass disc caught the neon light from outside, throwing strange reflections across the walls of my cab. With each swing, the screams grew slightly louder, more distinct, and I could begin to make out individual voices among the chorus of despair. There were men and women, young and old, all crying out in languages I couldn't identify, but in tones that transcended any linguistic barrier. The hands of the clock began to move, advancing slowly but steadily from 3:15. I watched in fascination and growing horror as the minute hand crept forward, and with each increment of its progress, the screams intensified. It was as if the clock was somehow feeding on those distant voices, drawing power from human suffering to mark the passage of time. I wanted to look away, to flee from my own truck and leave this impossible thing behind, but I found myself transfixed by the hypnotic swing of the pendulum and the terrible beauty of the mechanism's craftsmanship. Outside, the truck stop remained quiet except for the occasional rumble of another big rig pulling in or out of the parking area. The rain continued its steady percussion against my windshield, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the lonely whistle of a freight train crossing the valley. These familiar sounds of the road should have been comforting, but instead they seemed muted and distant, as if the clock was somehow isolating me from the normal world I knew. Their displays had gone dark, leaving only the grandfather clock to mark the passage of time. The realization sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cool night air seeping through the cab's window. Whatever this thing was, it was asserting dominance over my familiar environment, imposing its own twisted version of temporal reality. What had initially sounded like random cries of pain now seemed to follow a pattern, almost like a language of suffering. I found myself leaning closer to the clock, trying to decipher meaning in the anguished voices, when I heard something that stopped my heart completely. Among the chorus of unknown voices was one I recognized, one that belonged to my younger brother Danny, who had died in a car accident 15 years earlier. His voice was exactly as I remembered it, but filled with a pain and terror that Danny had never experienced in life. He was calling my name, pleading for help, begging me to make the pain stop. The rational part of my mind insisted this was impossible, that grief and stress and the strange circumstances were making me hear things that weren't there. But the emotional core of my being knew without doubt that Danny was somehow trapped inside that infernal timepiece, suffering endlessly to power its mechanical heart. I reached for the glass door of the clock's case, thinking I might somehow stop the pendulum and end the torment I was hearing. But as my fingers touched the brass handle, the temperature in my cab plummeted, my breath began to fog in the suddenly frigid air, and frost started forming on the windows, despite the mild California night outside. The screams reached a crescendo that threatened to burst my eardrums, and among them I began to hear new voices, more recent ones, crying out in fresh agony, as if they were being added to the clock's terrible fuel source. The hands of the clock began spinning wildly, no longer content to mark normal time, but racing through hours and days at an impossible pace. The pendulum swung so rapidly it became a blur, and the screams merged into a solid wall of human anguish that seemed to press against me from all directions. I realized with growing horror that the clock wasn't just running on the screams of the dead, but was actively harvesting new voices, pulling the life force from anyone who came too close to its malevolent influence. I could feel something fundamental draining away from me, some essential part of my being flowing into the clock's hungry mechanism. My own voice began to join the chorus, though I wasn't conscious of screaming. The sound seemed to tear itself from my throat without my permission, adding my terror to the fuel that kept the infernal timepiece running. The familiar interior of my truck cab began to fade around the edges, as if reality itself was being consumed by the clock's insatiable appetite for human suffering. My hands felt numb and distant, but I managed to grasp the handle and throw myself out into the parking lot. The moment I broke physical contact with the truck, the terrible draining sensation stopped, though I could still hear the muffled screams coming from inside my cab. I stumbled across the wet asphalt, my legs barely supporting my weight, until I reached the bright safety of the truck stop's main building. The clerk behind the counter looked up from his magazine with concern as I burst through the glass doors, soaked from the rain and probably wild-eyed with terror. I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost, which wasn't far from the truth. I tried to explain what was happening, but the words came out jumbled and incoherent. He offered to call the police or an ambulance. clearly thinking I was having some kind of breakdown. Through the windows of the truck stop, I could see my rig sitting in the parking lot, looking perfectly normal from the outside. The familiar blue and chrome of my Kenworth gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and everything appeared exactly as it should. But I knew that thing was still in there, still feeding on its collection of trapped voices, still marking time with human suffering. I called my dispatcher and told him I was sick, that I needed someone else to pick up my load. I couldn't bring myself to get back in that cab, not with that monstrosity waiting inside.